welcome to this. This event is hosted by BIRA and our Mathematics Education Special Interest Group. Okay, so I'm Jill Adams. I'm one of the BIRA SIG conveners. Gwen, unfortunately, isn't able to be with us for the morning. She'll be joining us during the day. She's had to step in and teach. And we're delighted too that Oh How Chen, the BSRLM outreach coordinator, is able to join us today to support the event. So we'll say a little bit more about that. I'm just going to go through very briefly a little bit of background about the special interest group. Some of you will be aware of this, some of you, this is newer for you. So there's a little bit of information there on the slide about BIRA membership. We are trying to increase representation from the other UK nations because at the moment membership's mainly in England. So we've been reaching out to the other UK nations. And our remit in the SIG is to develop, extend and enhance scholarly discussion and research capacity and to improve networking. And we've been working on that really for the last sort of year and a half, and before as the SIG conveners were doing the same thing. Some of the things that we've done and are doing at the moment are there on the slide. And this annual event today, the Practitioner Research in Mathematics Education event, is a really key part of the work that we do in the SIG, along with BSRLM. And you can see here just some slides from previous meetings. Some of you might have been at the last one in 2021, and there's a slide there from an earlier one. And those resources are on the website too. I'm not going to talk through the BIRA priorities in any great detail. They're there on the slide, and I encourage you to have a look if you're new to BIRA at those slides. One of the things we really want to prompt today is more people to join the BIRA conference and present their work in mathematics education. There is still time, not very much time. Deadlines for submission of abstracts is the 31st of January. We recently did a session supporting abstract writing, so we're hoping that there will be more submissions. And we really encourage you to think about symposia, or if you're a newer researcher, to put in a poster. When you're looking for mathematics education, it's grouped under STEM this year in the themes in BIRA conference. So do have a look there. I'm going to hand over to OHAO to just talk very briefly about BSRLM.
Hello, everyone. I'm OHAO and I'm from the BSRLM. So BSRLM is for British Society for Research into Learning Mathematics. So we have 3 or 4 conferences per year, and the next conference will be on 4th March 2023, and the submission has been open. So if you're interested in presenting some of your research in math education, please do submit your abstract. And the location will be in UCL, the University of College London. And Jill, could you please go to the next slide? Okay, so the BSLM will also have a very major conference in June. So in June, we before our main conference in June, we have a new research day. So we welcome the early career researchers to present their research in math education, and also based on the presentations from early career researchers, we will give a award for the best presentation, the best paper. And so if you are interested in this conference, please do submit your abstract. So the BSLM, we have some publications from BSLM. So firstly, if you want to publish some your research to the conference proceedings, we will give some support. And also BSRLM has our own journal called the Research in Math Education. So if you have some good papers and want to find some good outlets for your research, please do consider this journal as well. Thank you.
Emotions, values and expectancies towards compulsory resits in maths. My name is Amber Barnett and I'm currently course leader in teacher education at a Northern college. Previous to this, I taught maths resit students in another Northern college. The background to my study is that there is a growing body of literature that recognises the importance of emotions, values and expectancies in the context of student motivation and achievement in education. Motivation and its relationship to achievement has been of great interest in a wide range of fields, and recently this has been extended to educational contexts. This study is focused within a vocational land-based college in the north of England, and it focuses on RESIT, GCSE and functional skills mathematics students. I taught these students GCSE and functional skills maths for resits for many years before I moved to another college. As we know, these students are now compelled to resit mathematics, GCSE or functional skills until they pass, and the college funding is linked to this compulsory study. There is much anecdotal evidence from teachers, and my personal experience shows that these students can become disheartened and have negative emotions and lower motivation, and they question any value in their study of this maths. There's much recent research into motivation in different contexts, and lots of research into values, expectancies and emotions, including anxieties in other contexts. There's not very many studies into FE at all generally, and there's no studies into the emotions, values and expectancies towards maths of these resit further education students. I have seen their struggles on a day-to-day basis and see that they feel they're being failed by the very system that should be uplifting them. FE has traditionally allowed a second chance for these non-academic students and should provide opportunities to gain valuable vocational qualifications. As we know, achievement informs motivation, and emotions and previous achievement in emotions in turn are a predictor of further achievement in maths. These emotions, combined with students' perceptions of competence and control and value appraisals, result in some feedback loops, and these may be important for students compelled to resit. These students may lose motivation and develop negative achievement emotions as they fail, often repeatedly, and then they're forced to resit again and again. Previous studies also suggest there might be a gender aspect to this. There are around 150,000 students in this situation, and the typical pass rate of 22% shows it's not a small issue. The significance of the study is that there is a general lack of research into FE, and as we've seen, interventions in other fields and contexts may be useful and show positive results, that these interventions may also be successful in the context of resit GCSE mathematics. The literature review looked at motivation, self-concept, maths anxiety, test anxiety, control value and achievement value theories, and current research in FE, and gender was woven through all these topics. Motivation, I looked at general theories of motivation, excuse me, for example, simplistically dividing it into intrinsic and extrinsic. This has been questioned more recently. It has been argued that some students who are solely extrinsically motivated have lower academic achievement. Self-determination theory seeks to blend the intrinsic and extrinsic views of motivation. The self-concept and achievement motivation are correlated in diverse contexts. Self-belief and motivation are shown to be connected. PISA found that more than 40% of students have a negative maths self-concept, and for maths in general, higher maths skills positively correlates with maths self-concept, self-efficacy, while lower maths skills negatively correlates with maths anxiety. PISA also found that more than 40% of students don't recognise any value in maths, and we know that teachers can aid in changing this view. This is all against a background of students' motivation in maths declining throughout their schooling, particularly during adolescence. Gender academic self-concept is generally higher for males than females in STEM. And it has been argued that gender stereotypes and role socialization can explain gender differences in motivation in maths. There has been more effort to encourage females to enter STEM domains in an attempt to reduce the effects of gender stereotypes. But according to recent research, only 8% of females progress to a level 4 or higher in STEM subjects, and that suggests that these efforts have some way to go. Along with stereotyping of gender roles, research has shown that motivational beliefs can affect girls' entry into STEM fields. But it has been also shown that not all girls measure lower on maths motivational beliefs, and it can depend on race and ethnicity. Emotions, academic emotions emerge in educational contexts and can predict achievement activities or outcomes. Peckran found that positive activating emotions increase academic motivation, while negative deactivating emotions decrease it. And we find the following emotions tending to prevail in maths classrooms, such as pride, enjoyment, boredom, anxiety, shame, anger, and hopelessness. It has been argued that negative emotions are experienced as much as positive. In addition, self-concept of ability and value judgments can also be predictors of students' academic emotions. Academic emotions are considered integral to motivation and can predict maths achievement, and motivation and engagement has been shown to be influenced by perceived value and self-beliefs and is multidimensional. Expectancy values. The theory of expectancy value of achievement motivation combines aptitudes, beliefs, experiences, goals, self-concepts, interest, expectancy, and weighing of the utility against the cost of an action. Expectancy is confidence of success in a task, and it blends self-belief in effort and ability. Value is the importance, usefulness, or enjoyment related to success, and it has 4 components, which are attainment, intrinsic utility, and cost value. Eccles adapted her theories from other fields for education and argued that expectancies for success and subjective task values, including utility value, are the most useful indicators for achievement. Control value achievement emotions emerged from expectancy value theory and other approaches to achievement emotions, and these emotions are defined as emotions related to achievement and success and failure. They arise from cognitive appraisals by students of their control over and the perceived value achievement of activities and their outcomes. Emotions have an influence on all areas of life, so of course they are important in education, and in particular maths education and motivation. Emotions, along with motivation, achievement, and cognitive factors, play a combined role in maths learning and performance. Maths anxiety is feelings of fear and tension when engaging with maths. A large number of students experience maths anxiety. More than half of 15-year-old students frequently experience maths anxiety, according to PISA. Female participation in STEM is a challenge for most countries because low levels of self-confidence in STEM subjects among female students and maths anxiety can play a part in this and have a large life impact. Maths anxiety has been shown to predict career choices in American adolescents. Exam anxiety or test anxiety creates significant barriers to learning and performance. The highly test anxious students score significantly below the low anxiety peers, and it can result in low maths performance at any stage of education. Test anxiety can occur when there is low subjective control and high subjective value. High levels of test anxiety are connected with low maths performance at any age or level. There's a general lack of research into maths resets. there's only a few studies really that touch on this, and these are outlined here. And then there's the government GCSE policy, as we know, that compel these students to resit until they achieve grade 4 or higher. And the pass rate is around about 26%. The hypothesis for this study is exploratory. The main research question asks, is there a gender difference in further education students' emotions, values and expectancies in FE resits maths classes? And there are some sub-questions which I will outline later. My methodology was the use of the Achievement Emotions Questionnaire Maths from Peckran and the Self and Task Perceptions in the Domain of Mathematics Questionnaire from Eccles and Wigfield. Students on several different land-based vocational courses who were resitting GCSE or functional skills maths were asked to fill in the questionnaire. The results reflected the 4 different hypotheses, and they looked at several relationships, which I'll talk about shortly. So for the first result of the first hypothesis, we used a paired t-test and looked at the relationship between EVT values and CVT emotions. It found that there were no significant differences in enjoy, anger, or boredom emotions. There were some that were significantly affected by gender, and males showed higher positive emotion pride in exams than females did. Males also had lower negative emotions in anxiety, shame, and hopelessness. For the second hypothesis, there was the relationship between the expectancy value theory values This showed that there was no significant difference in male and female PTV or AER scores, and there was no significant difference in male and female overall PTD scores. When PTD was broken down into task difficulty and requires effort, there was no significant difference in requires effort, but there was a significant difference in task difficulty, and males all generally found that the task was less difficult than females thought. PTV is perceived task value, so how important is that? You do well in maths. AER is achievement expectancy value, so how good at maths are you? And perceived task difficulty is, in general, how hard is maths for you? The third hypothesis looked at correlations between the control value theory emotions. We found that there were some correlations between these emotions, as to be expected. So increases in perceived task value associated with increases in enjoyment and pride, decreases in PTV associated with increased anger, shame, hopelessness and boredom. Increases in AER were associated with increased enjoyment and pride. Decreases in AER were associated with increased anger, anxiety, shame, hopelessness and boredom. I also did a regression analysis on some of the categories, and I found that exam anxiety was not significant, but the trend was for the higher the anxiety, the less likely they were to pass. Perceived task value wasn't significant, but there was a trend for the higher the perceived task value, the less likely to pass, which is counter to what might be expected. Achievement expectancy value was significant, however, and the higher the achievement expectancy, the more likely the student was to pass. Perceived task difficulty wasn't significant, had no effect at all, but gender was significant and females were more likely to pass, even when controlled for all the factors above by a factor of 3 times. So this regression showed that achievement expectancy value, AER, for example, how good at maths are you, and gender can predict a pass. And so this may be of use in planning interventions. Limitations of the study showed that it was from a self-reported questionnaire. And also it was several months into the academic year by the time I was able to present the questionnaire. So I'd already had them for several months, and I had tried to bolster their motivation and confidence in that time. So it would have been better to present the questionnaire in the first week of the session. And the number of participants was quite small. Future research, several directions. So longitudinal research could look at the values over the year. And a more comprehensive study could dig deeper into Peckering and Eccles variables, which have various categories within them, whereas I joined them all together due to the nature of my research. You could look at different groups, for example, GCSE and FE resits, vocational areas, number of failures, and so on and so forth. Other ways of survey that are not self-reported, and various other future areas. Thank you for listening.
Yes, so that was great. Fabulous. So if we just take just a couple of minutes for questions now, if we can. So can you use the hands up reaction to if you've got a question, please. Sue.
Hi, thank you so much, Amber.
Hello,
I'm
Sue.
really hoping you're going to share your slides. A young
Yes,
lady
I can do that. Yes, yeah. I mean, there's a lot that I tried to get in, and there was too much to get in 15 minutes, obviously.
Absolutely.
So-
I'd love to contact with you. There's a lady who's just joined late called Miriam, who's doing work with expectancy value theory, and I'd really like you guys to connect with each other.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Yes.
And
Hello,
also
Miriam.
it's not a question, but to tell you that the CFEM has paid for a lot of action research this last few months in FE. And so the question would be, how do we gather as a SIG group all the knowledge from that from that teacher research into a collected compendium? Telma and I are going down to one of the conferences where some of this research is going to be reported, and they'll be happening all over the country between now and the end of March when the CFEM funding finishes. But this is such an important topic. Thank you very much.
Oh gosh, thank you so much. I'm absolutely overwhelmed by your comments.
Brilliant. Thank you. Are there other questions? There's a lot to take in. I wondered, Amber, whether there were any unexpected results, because you talked a little bit about some of the things that you might have expected from the limited previous studies, but what was unexpected?
I was surprised that that the test value didn't really have an effect, but I think that the problem is that it's so complex, obviously, is this area, and the categories that I use, so PTV, AER and PTD, are all actually, with Eccles and Peckering, subdivided into very many different subcategories. I joined them all together because obviously I couldn't do the subcategories as well, and I think maybe because some of them are a little bit contradictory within those subcategories, that delving deeper into that maybe would have had a different result. But I mean, these are human beings that we're looking at in desperate situations. Actually, some of them, it's awful for them, and so I think unexpected results are to be expected, if you see what I mean. I feel very strongly that the direction that these poor students are put in is very wrong, and I mean, that probably makes my research a bit biased, I don't know, but it's something needs to be done to change what's happening to them, I think.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And I take your point, Sue, that it may be people working in this area might want to propose a BERA SIG Maths Education SIG meeting, particularly around that, or a particular conference.
That would be
Jenny
absolutely
Stacey at Sheffield
fantastic.
Hallam University is also just completing a doctorate. She's taken a more qualitative approach, I think, but again, interesting to look at those GCSE resits. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It feels like a real privilege to be here. So I'm Kia. I teach at a secondary school, a kind of standard secondary, 11 through to 18, state maintained. Teach everything from year 8 up to year 13. So get a full spectrum of kind of mathematics. What I want to chat about is whether or not maths teachers exemplify perseverance in a real, genuine problem-solving manner, and what enables them to do this in the classroom, or what prevents them from actually being able to exemplify that. So over the next 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about why this is of interest to me, what made me kind of decide to have a look at this, a bit of the research background, and then the little project I did to have a look at this and investigate it. So a little bit on my background to start with. Prior to teaching, I was a rock climbing coach and guide for about 5-6 years. So I'd work with athletes from quite high performing rock climbers to youth teams. And then I trained as a maths teacher, going back to what my original degree was. And as you do when you're new to a profession, you go and meet lots of other maths teachers and kind of try and garner some skills from there. And one of the things that I picked up on quite a lot was people were saying, oh, I've sat down and done this entire exercise because I'm setting it to my class tomorrow. And that just struck me as really odd, because they were giving the reason that, oh, it means that if someone asks me a question about it, I know exactly how the question goes and where it's going. And I thought that's kind of weird, because if I'm working with an elite climber, they're doing climbs that I can't do by nature of them being on the national team and me not. And if I'm working with a youth climber, I'm very open about the fact that I'm trying rock climbs that will take me 2-3 years to be successful, because I want them to know that perseverance is important. So there seems like a bit of a discrepancy there between what I'm hearing some people are doing in the maths classroom and what I'd been used to doing in a sporting environment, and who knows what it was I was doing in the maths classroom then. So I thought this warranted a bit of investigation. And this idea of perseverance, I feel it's really nicely summed up by this little graphic from a chap called Brendan Leonard, who's on Instagram at semirad. He's got loads of great charts like this. So if you ever need to teach bar graphs or line graphs and you want a really fun, entertaining charts to start it off with, have a look at him. Anyway, so I thought this needed a bit of investigating, something I wanted to look at. So when I came to start a Masters in Learning and Teaching at the University of Oxford, it seemed like a good starting point for me for my first year project. So I'm focusing in specifically on perseverance and mathematical reasoning and picking up on Barnes' definition from that. I think there's a slight, we need to draw the distinction between perseverance and persistence. So my students are generally okay at persisting. They'll keep generating specific examples, but they're not very good at extending it. Or if they feel like they're stuck and they can't just keep getting more and more examples, they won't be able to generalize it. And that's when I notice they kind of give up, they become dejected. So for me, the gold standard in the exemplification of perseverance in the classroom comes from Alan Schoenfeld, and this kind of example of a cognitive apprenticeship. So like with a traditional apprenticeship where you observe your master craftsperson, you copy the skills they're doing, they gradually give you a bit more responsibility, and then a few years down the line, you're building cabinets or whatever it is your apprenticeship is in. The same thing holds in education. And Schoenfeld sums this up so well for me on that central quote, which is on screen. Mathematics looks so easy for us that they feel incompetent when it's difficult for them. And of course, for my students, and this isn't anything about my maths ability, but I'm quite probably the best mathematician they've ever met. And that's not because I'm a super talented mathematician at all. It's just the environment they're in. And so if they never see maths as something that I have to struggle with, that I have to persevere with, it feels really alien to them when they're having to persevere with mathematics. And actually, for me, one of the real joys of mathematics is getting stuck and working through a problem, and hopefully that aha moment. So yeah, I think it's really important that they should be seeing that. So maybe we should be thinking kind of slightly more as Claxton is, and that it's as much about modelling those learning characteristics as it is going through, factorising, expanding brackets, all of those sorts of things. And of course, perseverance is a huge skill outside of the maths classroom. It's one of those things that we want students to go off into the world and have a bit of sticking power and be able to keep going with stuff. So my little project was, I chatted to some maths teachers, basically. We sat down, we had a semi-structured interview, chatted to teachers for about half an hour, using these 4 questions that you've got on screen for you as kind of the framework for our discussion. And then I used Braun and Clark's idea of thematic analysis to go through and kind of code the responses that I got from those interviews and start to kind of draw out what I thought were the themes that were coming out from this. So I think I'm just going to show you a quick bit of overview on who the participants were. So these were the 6 people I spoke to, and as I said, it is a really small study. It kind of uses Braun's idea of a suitable sample size for this sort of small research student early study. What this gives you, hopefully, is a quick overview on the background of the teachers I was speaking to. So there's a real mix in terms of degree background there, so how much personal mathematics experience they have, and teaching background as well. I also piloted the study on a 7th participant who isn't included in here. And obviously, I'm really grateful to these 6 teachers for giving up their time. So big thanks to them for doing that. Otherwise, it just wouldn't have worked. Other things just to draw from this, that there's a nice mix of males and females in here. Good mix of backgrounds. What there isn't is any Black or minority ethnic participants. And I do think that's something that would be interesting to explore in terms of whether that is an impacting factor on the exemplification of perseverance. And unfortunately, teaching in Dorset and Somerset, it's a very largely white teaching body. So students just don't get that opportunity to have role models from different ethnicities. So the themes that came out from these are the 4 themes on screen. And I'll give you a moment to have a little read through those while I'm talking. And that teacher action to encourage perseverance in mathematical reasoning, I guess, is really what answers that initial question of, are teachers exemplifying perseverance in the classroom? Explicit actions and implicit actions are picked up by Kistner as being kind of 2 ways that self-regulated learning strategies are being taught. So explicit actions being kind of telling students a direct strategy, implicit actions being the things we're doing, and then students picking up on those as we're going. So over the next few minutes, I'm just going to kind of talk through a couple of the key points for me from each of these themes. And of course, as is with thematic analysis, if someone else looked through this interview data, I'm sure they'll draw out different themes from it. And that would also be really interesting. So teacher action to encourage perseverance in mathematical reasoning. All of the participants I spoke to said they thought it was really important that students felt it was okay to make mistakes. Participants 1 through to 3, so they were those who had a maths-based degree and a significant amount of experience in teaching. Without any kind of prompt from me, they spoke about perseverance and that they thought perseverance was a really important trait for their students to develop. Those 3 participants could also all give me examples of times they've genuinely had to solve a problem in front of students, a time where they'd got stuck and had to really show perseverance in mathematical reasoning. Contrasting that, participants 4 and 6, who were the least experienced in terms of years teaching, spoke about things they did to encourage perseverance, but these were prompts that they would give students, or they were particular tasks they knew that students would have to persevere a little bit longer with. So much more of those explicit actions rather than the implicit actions. And participant 6 went back to, and this wasn't one of the people I'd initially spoke to that got me thinking about this, the idea that they have a full set of work solutions for every question that they pose students. And they said this meant that if a student got stuck, they could say, right, I know exactly what they need to think about next on the problem. And so it gave them a way of giving a student a steer in the right direction. But I found myself thinking this is a little bit of an avoidance technique as well, because actually you're never having to genuinely think mathematically in front of those students, which maybe deprives them of something. And then participant 5 had some quite strong views on the fact that they thought students shouldn't ever really see them having to genuinely solve problems. And so they talked about, well, their quotes on screen, I won't read it out to you. And they kind of talked about the impact they thought that would have on how their students viewed them. And so that goes on to be explored a little bit in the second theme. Teachers' perceptions of students' reaction to teachers becoming stuck. I probably should have come up with a catchier title for that. Just to kind of make this clear, this isn't students' views. This is what teachers think students think. And actually, gathering students' views would be amazing. And a really interesting area to go with this would be to also kind of get some student opinion of what happens when they see a teacher become stuck. But that's not what I did. So for me, this is a bit of a chicken and egg situation, because is it that teachers think their students are going to be horrified if they become stuck, and so they never find themselves in a position where they're going to have to persevere mathematically? Or is it that they had a terrible experience and the class rioted when they became stuck, and so they're never going to go back to it? So which leads to which, or that interplay isn't completely clear to me. So, sorry, I've lost my train of thought slightly. Participants 1 to 3, those who were experienced maths teachers with a strong mathematical background, they could all recall times that they've been stuck in front of students, And so they drew on how they thought the class reacted. Some of them were thinking back to the last week, some of them were thinking back a couple of years, but they had overwhelmingly positive experiences. They thought that their students benefited from seeing them become stuck and having to persevere and show that perseverance with their mathematical reasoning. In contrast to that, participants 5 and 6 couldn't ever recall a situation where they've actually been stuck in front of a class and the class were aware of that. And so they hypothesized about what they thought students would react. And you can see there's some quite strong opinions that they have in how they thought their students would react if they ever saw them actually have to persevere mathematically. And then participant 4 spoke about the fact that they don't have a maths degree and their students are very aware that they don't have a maths degree. And that makes it okay for them to persevere because their students know that they're not a maths expert. The fact that they could get stuck and have to think through things was okay, but that they'd feel quite embarrassed if they were sitting there with a maths degree and got stuck and had to work through something in real time. And for me, that was really telling because I kind of think perseverance is a great trait of a mathematician. It's one of those things that, like, you know, much more than being able to add up efficiently, being able to keep going with something is a real benefit of being a strong mathematician. And so this participant maybe doesn't view perseverance in that same way as something to be proud of, and something that contributes to you being a competent mathematician. All of the participants spoke about the fact that the relationships they have with students will make a massive difference on how students would perceive them. And people said things like, you know, if I was ever stuck doing maths in front of a cover class, it would be an absolute nightmare. And so those relationships are the things that we kind of explore in the next theme. So lots of the participants spoke about involving students in the problem-solving process if they were to become stuck. So participants 1 through to 3 spoke about how if they got stuck on a problem, if a student brought in a question for them and they became stuck on that, they would try and get the rest of the class involved. So they'd ask other students what they thought they should do, and it would be teacher and students working collaboratively to try and solve a problem, which to me sounds amazing. And I love it when we do that. And then a couple of the other participants, so participants 5 and 6, they spoke about how they would use students to enable them to have a bit of time to think. So they would kind of circle around a classroom and ask students, you know, oh, what do you think this is? What do you think this is? What do you think this is? And that would give them a bit of time to Google a mark scheme or look something in a textbook. So there's a real avoidance there in terms of students seeing them becoming stuck. I think it's quite interesting with both of those two participants that they are not from a mathematical background. And Chapman draws this inference that to be able to teach problem-solving skills well, you need a strong personal experience of problem solving. And so perhaps for those two participants who don't have that personal mathematical experience, that's an impact on their ability to teach those problem-solving skills in that way. And then the other big relationship that came out from this was about the relationships that teachers have with their colleagues and how that can impact their ability to persevere mathematically in a genuine way. So whether or not that's going back to the staff room and saying, oh, I had to really think through that problem with year 9 and it took me 5 minutes of doing it in real time and being able to have that dialogue with a colleague, or whether that's going to a colleague with a question that you're going to use as an example and asking them to help you with it, or whether it's because you've highlighted there's a gap in your subject knowledge, which is a slightly different thing. But initially, this always seems like a really positive thing that all of the participants I spoke to, when they spoke about their colleagues, had these positive things about perseverance. But then I find myself thinking, if you need a safe space to be able to persevere, maybe perseverance isn't viewed as that positive thing. And in fact, if you have to be in an environment where you feel really comfortable and you feel well supported, maybe it's not that really positive thing that you're proud of you being able to do. And in fact, you're still not viewing it in quite that same positive light that I thought we might be. But then the final thing to talk about is the idea of perseverance for all. So not every student is going to have the same experience of perseverance being exemplified to them, even if they all had the same maths teacher. And that might be because of the age they are. So a year 7 student versus a year 13 student. It might be because of what they're studying. So foundation GCSE versus higher GCSE. So they're just not seeing the same content. And of course, I think you probably are less likely as a maths teacher to encounter a problem that's going to really stump you and give you that joyous, oh, I'm stuck feeling. If you're doing year 7 work, as you are with 13 further maths. And so a few of the participants spoke about the idea of dramatizing the problem solving process. And this is something that Polya really advocates for. So they spoke about the fact that a problem wouldn't require them to draw a diagram. They don't need a diagram to solve it, but of course they're going to draw a diagram to show their students that that's a really useful heuristic to use. And they said the same thing about perseverance, that maybe they will show having to think a little bit more and kind of over-egg that a touch, so that the students kind of get a feel for the fact that perseverance is part of mathematics, even if it's not something that they're really having to do. Participant 5 took that a little bit further. They spoke about the fact that it gives them a way of teaching problem solving without having to genuinely problem solve. So if they've got this kind of script where they know where the problem's going, they know what they're going to show off, so drawing a picture or putting a solution back in to check whether it seems sensible, all those sort of things, they don't have to genuinely solve a problem, but their students can see them solving a problem. And I think that's quite telling in some ways about how they're viewing the problem solving process and their own view on it. And then participant 6 had this view that if they were to show certain groups of students them having to genuinely solve a problem, it would cause them a lot of anxiety and really hinder their learning. And they were talking particularly about lower ability students or students who struggle mathematically. And if they saw that a maths teacher struggled to solve a problem, that could be a real problem for those students. The other theme that came through from this a little bit was the 2 most experienced teachers had both done a fair amount of work, both mentoring new teachers and trainee teachers. And they spoke about the fact that they felt like if someone was new to the profession, being able to genuinely exemplify perseverance would be a really challenging thing to ask, because you're managing behaviour, you're assessing learning, you've got all of those other things going on. And so to actually have the space in your head to genuinely think mathematically is probably too much to ask from someone in their first few years of teaching. And so we should definitely, as colleagues, be aware that not all of the people we work with currently have the space in their head to exemplify perseverance. And so that's something that we should definitely kind of give a little bit of thought to moving forwards. So on that moving forwards thing, future research directions for this, I guess the 3 things that I've kind of touched on here is about the sample size, and that's talking to more teachers, covering a broader range of backgrounds, triangulating the information a little bit better. So it'd be lovely to observe some teachers as well. So whilst it's great hearing what people think they do, of course, that's not always what they actually do. And so having some observations to go alongside the interviews, and getting some student opinions to find the student point of view of when they have to see their teachers genuinely persevere mathematically. In terms of the big thing that I'm going to be doing with my practice, I think it's about trying to foster a culture in a department where we are really promoting perseverance as a positive trait. Is something that we should be really bigging up, just like we promote checking your work and that sort of thing. And then thinking about other ways that we can exemplify perseverance. And that's where I'm going on this kind of the second year of my master's in learning and teaching, and thinking about the other problem solving heuristics that actually we can show in contexts that aren't necessarily solving a maths problem, but still showing our students that it's transferable, but there's perhaps other ways we can start to show those things. Really appreciate you giving me the time to chat. Yeah, I think that's me done. Thank you.
Wow, thanks so much, Kia. I've got tons of questions. That was fabulous. Thank you. I'm not going to start with my questions, though. I'm going to open up to other people. It sounds like you've got the makings of several PhD studies there anyway lined up. So really exciting.
Hopefully.
So do people want to indicate hands up if they've got a question, please? Is that I can't see first names now. Is it Lewis? Yes, Lewis, please go for it.
Right, thanks, Jill. Thank you, Kia. It was a really great presentation. I really enjoyed that. My thought really came about as obviously you were very clear that you believe that teachers modelling perseverance has a positive impact on students. That's where you start your approach. And I wonder if you haven't spoken to students about what impact it does have. What sort of negative implications do you think that modelling perseverance could have on students in the classroom?
I think that's really interesting, Lewis. So kind of picking up on that one participant who thought it would cause a lot of anxiety in some of their students. And I think there is definitely something to be considered there, that some students may see something and go, well, if my teacher, who's a maths expert, in inverted commas perhaps, has had to get stuck on this and really think about it, how on earth are they expecting me to do it? So I do think there has to be something really kind of, there's a careful balance to be struck there in terms of the idea that maths requires thinking, but also what we're expecting our students to understand about us as humans, and about thinking isn't necessarily getting to an answer quickly.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, really interesting topic, and a really interesting. I come from a primary background, and I'm thinking about, we don't. I'm a math specialist teacher, but the rest of my colleagues are not math specialists, and actually quite a few of my colleagues find maths quite daunting themselves, and they do quite often, portray to the children that they're not maths experts as well. So I'm thinking of a primary background, and sometimes that's really helpful, but I know in other instances it's really not helpful when you're thinking about almost instilling a maths anxiety in children when the teacher is slightly flailing at the same time. So it's just a different angle to come at it. But thank you, Keir.
No, thank you. That's really interesting, isn't it? That kind of being worried about maths and struggling being a good thing versus struggling being a bad thing, and that kind of, for some of us, like, struggling with a maths problem is an amazing feeling, and that's the best way to spend a Sunday morning. But for some people, struggling with a maths problem is the worst possible feeling they could possibly have in the world. And which one of those two things we're showing students, I guess, is really important.
I'm wondering what came up for the other participants in terms of what they might want to do next. So you've got ideas about what you want to do next, but in terms of them, did it raise things that they wanted to continue grappling with, I suppose, is my question.
So one of the things I kind of chatted to them about was that idea that Schoenfeld, in that problem solving course that got quite a lot of writing about in kind of the mid 80s, where students could pose problems to him. And I asked, like, if I gave you an envelope with unseen problems in, and asked you to work through those in front of your class, how would you feel about that? And I thought that was really interesting. That the people I chatted to about it kind of quite polarized views there. So some thought that would be a really interesting thing. Some thought they would love it. But lots of people didn't think necessarily that would be educationally beneficial, because they didn't quite know what the points they wanted to draw, which if they were doing a lesson on, I don't know, a ratio and proportion thing, they knew the points mathematically they wanted to stress, even if the actual problem was tough for them. So I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating. There's something about perhaps the environment that we teach in as well, and what's valued in sort of these high stakes measures. Thank you, Sue.
Thank you. Again, a wonderful, wonderful study. I've put a suggestion in about encouraging the role play side, because that kind of deals with Lewis's point about teachers having their own maths anxiety. I think it also connects with your point about why do people need a safe space? And I think it's helpful, some of us are working with the growth zone model, to think of terms of the teachers having their own growth zone model. So there's that comfort zone where they feel they know what's going on, and then the challenge space if something goes wrong, but they feel they've got enough support to manage that situation. And then that threat space, which some of your teachers have articulated very clearly, which is about feeling that the children might either not learn or not be efficiently learning because we're under time pressure, or create chaos. And so I think it's helpful to think about the teachers having their own growth zone, as it were, rather than thinking all mathematicians love solving problems. So when you say why a safe space, I would call it that orange zone a brave space, drawing on the literature from anti-racism and from Brené Brown, and say that in order to have a brave space, you need to know that your colleagues aren't going to think the worst of you. One of our researchers came up with, if you ask questions, if you ask for help, then the sort of culture says that you might be more stupid than they thought. So we've got a lot of culture to overcome, but please keep us posted with all the research you're going to do next.
Thank you. That's really interesting.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. So my name is Jack and I work at the University of Derby. And I just wanted to spend some time this morning talking a little bit about some research that I've been doing with some of our students who are on the primary IT course. So these are students who are training to be primary school teachers at the University of Derby. And this is an ongoing research project that I wanted to share with everyone. So focusing around non-examples and conceptual variation. So this really started off with an activity, and you might be wondering, well, why have we got Jaffa cakes on the screen? But this started off with an activity where I gave our students a range of images, and I asked them to sort these images and to think about how they might go about grouping these. So we use Jaffa cakes because it's often one of those things that is a bit contested in terms of what is it, what should be in it, what does it look like, etc., etc. So I gave the students a variety of images, and I didn't say anything else, and I just said to them, right, I want you to kind of group these. And what was quite interesting straight away was certain things started to happen with the students. So developing arguments, for example, they were conjecturing, and immediately we could see that they were starting to think about, well, what does that mean for it to be a Jaffa cake, for example? What does it mean for it to not be something? So they were conjecturing, arguing. They were starting to use language, and this is the other thing that I think will come from this kind of activity, is we start to see them using more refined and careful use of language to describe why they think something is this or why it isn't this. So they were trying to use different types of language. Again, formulating characteristics. They're talking about why a Jaffa cake is a Jaffa cake, why it isn't. So just an example. It was a dialogic process, so immediately it started to get people to talk about it. There wasn't any encouragement. I just kind of left it there, and there was immediately people were starting to, the students were talking. They were generalizing, so they got to the point where they were saying, well, in general, this is what this has to have. This is what a Jaffa cake has to have, for example. It was one activity with many levels, and I think this is the other valuable thing about doing some of this work that I'm going to go into today, is that it allows anyone to have access to it, and everybody could access it on different levels. So there were some students who surprisingly had never had a Jaffa cake. I was shocked by this, but you know, they had the opportunity to have a go. And throughout this, I was using recalcitrant questioning, which is this kind of obstinate questioning. So I wasn't giving any answers. I was basically getting them all the time to justify why they thought it was this and why they thought it was something different, for example. So this was just an introductory activity looking at non-examples. So we're trying to think about how non-examples could be used. So today I just want to really contextualise non-examples within the English national curriculum. It is applicable to the Welsh and the Scottish curriculum as well, but I want to really contextualise within the English national curriculum to explore the research project that's currently been undertaken. So it is currently underway at the moment. It started, it hasn't finished, and I am hoping that I can present some of this data at BERA conference later in the year if it gets accepted. And also to consider the implications of this on practice as well, whether that be pedagogy or assessment in different ways. So why the use of non-examples? Well, the national curriculum has many different things that we want to be hitting and aiming at. So a few of the things that are in there are conjecturing, looking at relationships, and really importantly, generalizing. So John Mason often says that if mathematics lessons aren't using generalizing skills, is it really mathematics? So he made that point. And looking at non-examples, that's one of the things that we're asking learners to do, is that concept acquisition and generalizing. Again, solving problems with increasing sophistication as well. The NCTM, obviously one of the main strands they're looking at is this variation, conceptual variation, and non-examples sits within that variation. So it's, you know, trying to hit some of those big ideas as well in being used by the NCTM in terms of mastery practice as well. Okay, so if we think about non-examples, quite often in practice we see certainly pre-service teachers, and this is something that I've seen through a lot of observation, we tend to know that teachers use examples quite often. More often than not, they will often revert to standard examples, so and non-standard examples. But what I wanted to look at here was how often and how successfully teachers are using non-examples. And within that, we can also subdivide that into standard and non-standard non-examples, or as Samir calls them, intuitive and non-intuitive non-examples. So in my experience, we often see lots of examples being used, but non-examples tend to be used less frequently. However, what you would do tend to see is, or I've noticed is, when they are coming up, especially in materials and resources, perhaps teachers aren't having that depth of knowledge about them, so they aren't able to maximize on the learning opportunities with regards to those. So this work is based on work that was done by Samir in 2008, and they've been building on this slowly with their colleagues. So what did they look at? Well, obviously examples, we know that there are examples of, for example, triangle. And on the slide there, we can see examples of intuitive or standard and non-intuitive or non-standard examples of something. But below we can see non-examples. So what I was really interested in was looking at, well, how do pre-service teachers use non-examples in their teaching, and particularly how they use them in concept acquisition with their students. Are they aware of what non-examples are? Do they know how they can use them as a pedagogical tool? Do they know how to use them as an assessment practice? So using them to understand and develop an understanding of students' understanding of concepts. So of course, within that, we've got intuitive non-examples. Well, we know that a square is not a triangle. So that's, yep, straight away that tells us that they understand that. But what I'm really interested in is this non-intuitive non-examples, which are those non-examples which are quite similar to examples, but they're slightly different, or they don't fit the characteristics of the actual concept itself. And in doing so, what we see is that students will develop a much deeper, or we might say masterly understanding of mathematical concepts. So this is what I was really interested in, to understand to what extent our students understood these non-intuitive non-examples. So 2015, so more relatively recently, Samir did some more research looking at early years teachers' use of concept images and definitions. Again, they found that non-examples were used less frequently, and non-intuitive non-examples were used even less frequently again. So we can still see that they're being underutilized in terms of pedagogy and developing students' understanding of mathematical concepts. So there's just some literature there relating to the work that they've done. We can talk about direct instruction, and often that's how we do. We might go about teaching something. Our pedagogy might be based on developing a sense of what something is. So this is a triangle, and giving that to our learners. But non-examples help us to develop children's learning and understanding through getting them to conjecture, to argue, and to think basically that deeper thinking around what a concept is. So non-examples play a dual role in conceptualization because they both tell us about the concept itself, but also they can help us to understand how it impacts on thinking. And also they're very useful, I found as well, in helping us to find misconceptions, or what we might call under or over generalizations in learners' understanding. So they're also performing this function as well in terms of the landscape. So here are some examples from White Rose Mathematics, so a mastery program that's often referred to in the slides are at the bottom there. So here we can see from year one some examples of non-examples being used. Now, what's interesting about this is, whilst they are implicitly being used, they're not explicitly being referred to as non-examples. So in the example on the right, we can see there Max is sorting 2D shapes. So non-squares. Okay, so well there we can see a really good example of an intuitive non-example. Sorry, I'm saying examples quite a lot, so I apologize. But how do we know that the learners really understand the characteristics of that example of what a non-square looks like? So going into greater detail. Now, what I found when I spoke to pre-service teachers was, whilst that they implicitly knew that these were non-examples, they didn't explicitly know. They didn't have that depth of subject knowledge, so therefore they couldn't maximize on that learning opportunity. They couldn't push that any further. Well, they knew that they were non-squares, for example, but they couldn't take that any further because their own subject and pedagogic knowledge was limited because they didn't know about non-intuitive non-examples. So again, from EYFS in the top left-hand corner there, we can see hints of it coming out. Choose one of the shapes. What do you notice? Are all the sides curved or straight? Can you see other shapes like that? So we're being led towards almost finding non-examples or getting the learners to think about a non-example of a particular type of shape, but it's not explicit. And that's what I also wanted to find out in this piece of research. So after doing some sorry, you've got your hand up. Oh yeah.
Yeah, 5 minutes left.
Brilliant, thank you. So after doing some pre-data collection, which I'll talk about shortly, I then did an intervention with this particular cohort of pre-service teachers. So we explicitly talked about what is a non-example, and to do that we used a Freya model, which is this model on the left here, and use this to create almost like an inductive methodology. So instead of starting off with a concept saying, well, this is a triangle, for example, these are its characteristics, we started from the other end. We gave lots of examples and sorted them into, well, what is a non-example? What is an example? And from that, they were then able to define the characteristics and give a definition. So it's almost working backwards to how we would normally pedagogically work. We start with an observation, the learners start to recognize patterns, and then they start to generalize. So it's almost backwards, this inductive kind of pedagogical approach. And again, supported by this recalcitrant questioning, which is continuously almost put in blocks, which is very frustrating for people, but it really helps us to develop that. So the benefits in terms of that straight away from that intervention that came from those participants was, well, they straight away could see pedagogic benefits in terms of just varying their pedagogy and the impact that that could have on their learning and teaching. They developed a more specialized content knowledge. So their understanding of curricula, the primary mathematics curricula, was much further developed because of these concept acquisitions. And their own subject knowledge was developed in terms of how they would push on learners and how they would develop their learners' understanding. Some other side benefits of this was more refined mathematical language. They were being forced to use more definitive language in terms of their understanding of concepts, their inductive reasoning skills, again, mathematical misconception analysis. They recognized that they could use these to understand where learners might have misconceptions. There were assessment implications, and also they were thinking about adaptive teaching. So very briefly, the pilot study that I'm looking at the moment, we've sort of answered the first two objectives of this pilot study, which is a very small group of students, but it's about gauging pre-service teachers' knowledge of and confidence in using non-examples, and to explore if and how such non-examples are currently used in their practice. So I've already got that data because I asked them this at the beginning of the study, and we're going to be also thinking about exploring how subject knowledge of non-examples might stimulate intra-mathematical connections. That's going to be developed after they've been on practice. So they're currently on practice, these students, and that will be explored later on. And then also think about how the intervention might have impacted upon their pedagogical practice in school. So that's just some information. So there was 11 participants, 8 female, 3 male. They're undergraduate students. And the 3 phases of this is the data collection, which was a pre-placement survey, intervention and placement, and then data collection after that's taken place. And I won't go into this into too much detail, but again, I utilised a case model scale and used a Likert scale to get their understanding at the beginning of this, looking at their knowledge, their attitudes, how much they've accessed, and their confidence in using non-examples in their own practice. So just some data that's come from that very briefly. So in terms of knowledge of non-examples, so whilst some of the students did have knowledge, what was clear was they had limited explicit knowledge. So they knew that they knew about them, but it was less explicit than they realised, and limited knowledge of application of these in practical senses. In terms of the access, again, they felt that they'd had limited explicit access to non-examples in their own practice, and limited knowledge of application as well. And again, confidence-wise, what was quite interesting was there was a lot of responses that they didn't know or they weren't sure. So again, lacking confidence in being able to use those non-examples in their own pedagogy, what they are and how they would use them in assessment as well. So that was the kind of data that was coming from these students at the beginning. Okay, so just to finish with then, so what were the preliminary findings? So participants had a limited explicit knowledge and limited confidence in utilising non-examples in their practice. They knew what they were, but when we talked about them in terms of the specific language, they were lacking in that knowledge. They had little confidence in utilising them in their own pedagogy and assessment. So looking forward, so thinking about moving this forward, how might we utilise non-examples outside of shape and measure curricula? So that's already been done by Avku, who's used this in terms of rational numbers, and that's some really great research, and that's in the references if anybody wants to look at that. How might we use non-examples to expand our assessment practice? So that might be formative, it might be summative, it might be synoptic, so helping us to develop an understanding of how students are connecting maths curricula. Do we need a more explicit form of instruction? Does it need to be more explicitly taught when we talk about conceptual variation in terms of non-examples? Are all teachers confident in maximising those non-example experiences? And more explicitly understanding and teaching how non-examples function within those spheres of different areas of the curriculum. So that's where I've got so far. Again, really interested to hear what people's thoughts are, good or bad, and get some feedback. And if anybody wants to kind of contact me about it, there's my contact details there, and I am on Twitter if anybody wants to get in contact. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack. Very good presentation, very interesting. So,
Thank you.
so now, if you have any questions from, if you have any question, please hands up so I can monitor the Q&A session. So, any questions? Okay, so Matt.
Good morning, Jack. Thank you for your presentation.
Morning, Matt.
I just wondered if you could talk to us a little bit more about the Freya models. They always seem a really good idea for adults for me and less good idea for young people. And I just wondered if you could tell us what the experience of your trainees was with them.
Yeah, so it was quite interesting because, again, this was another thing that the trainees had limited experience with. And I wondered whether, Matt, as well, it was because, again, we're not so clear maybe in explicitly teaching about non-examples and examples. So the students, when I offered them these as part of the intervention, they absolutely loved them. They thought they were brilliant. Interestingly as well, they hadn't seen them on placement being used in schools either. So again, and of course, we encourage them to critique and to find issues and problems. And very similarly to you, they said, well, this is quite useful in terms of maybe Key Stage 2 children. But again, what about Key Stage 1 children and younger children? So they were quite interesting. What they decided was, instead of using them as maybe like a tool for like drawing things on, they would maybe use other representations. So let's say, for example, they were doing 3D shapes. One of the students has said, well, instead of them drawing them, we might give them a box of shapes and get them to put them inside the model, or we might give them definitions and they have to pick which one they think most appropriately matches the particular concept, for example. So yeah, they were quite critical of using the Freya models for themselves. They were particularly useful because it made them refine it. But in terms of for their own subject knowledge, but in terms of using with students, they felt they needed some adapting. Adaptation was needed for them. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I think that's really interesting, isn't it? And nice to hear, because I guess what we really want is the reasoning to come out. And I love the adaptations you said, giving young people the opportunity to reason and think through.
And this was what came up really clearly for me. And I just did this. I've done this exercise with teachers as well as some CPD. And I use the Jaffakix because it's quite a nice open way. But what was really surprising to me was just how quickly people straight away started to develop these skills of conjecturing, arguing, generalizing. It was almost instantaneous that they were starting to say, well, it can't be this because it hasn't got this, or it can't be that. And that was the skill for me that I felt was so valuable, was that they started immediately to generalize, develop characteristics around these particular concepts, but also how inclusive it was, that everyone could join in with this, regardless of their ability, because it was very visual, or it brought it to them, really, this task, rather than having to go out and think about it in a particularly hard way, for example. But yeah.
Thank you, Jack.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, so the next one is from Lorraine.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm not going to put my camera on because I keep knocking out with the Wi-Fi. And so I may have missed a bit, and I hope this doesn't sound like a stupid question, but I'm interested in your point about the difference between explicitly and implicitly understanding non-concept variation. How did that manifest?
Yeah, it was a really great question actually, because when we did this data exercise, Lorraine, obviously I sent out this questionnaire to the students before we did this intervention, and what was quite interesting to me was the difference when we did the intervention. The students made comments such as, "Oh, I understand what a non-example is now," or "Oh, yeah, I've used those before in my teaching." Things like that. But when I gave it to them as a questionnaire and said, well, how do you use non-examples in your pedagogy? They said things like, well, I haven't, or I don't know what that is, or I'm not sure. So it was almost like I had to give examples of non-examples for them to understand what a non-example was. When they started to interact with the non-examples, again, they were quite critical in terms of, they felt that maybe they might be overwhelming for students, or maybe that it would be an extra layer for learners, particularly younger learners, to have to cope with. You know, maybe it's a bit cognitive overload in terms of that. But it was this kind of explicitness of referring to them, which we haven't really done before, maybe with these particular students. And when we did that they then started to notice how useful they maybe were in their own pedagogy, and that's what I'm interested to find out once they've come back from practice, is now that they are more explicitly aware of them, how have they used them in their own practice to develop you know, knowledge, deeper understanding, and also intra-mathematical connections. How are they linking maths to, you know, students linking maths together? So they obviously had an implicit knowledge of them because they taught them before and they knew what they were, but they just didn't have such an explicit knowledge of what they were. And that came out in the intervention.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I almost feel like with the students I work with, it's similar. It's anecdotal, I know, but it's almost like layers. On the first level, they might understand it implicitly, and then they understand it explicitly, but then they have to use it in their practice. It's like those, and you almost lose students on that journey, that some might be at the implicit stage, and you've got a few that are actually using it in their practice. So really interesting. I shall look out for the research. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So probably we are going to have the final question for Jack. So anyone wants to take this chance? Okay, Sarah.
Hi, Jack. Thanks for your presentation.
Hello.
I just wondered, in terms of you were talking about the kind of comparison of the subject and pedagogical content knowledge sort of before and after the intervention. Can you give maybe one or two examples of how you kind of measured this using, I think you said you did this using the questionnaire, is that right? Yeah, could you give an example of maybe some of the sort of questions and options to highlight how you did that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
So I've only done the pre-questionnaire, so they're on placement, so I haven't got any data from them coming back yet. So the question was divided into 4 areas. So it was around knowledge, access to non-examples, knowledge, access, confidence, and I've forgotten the last one. Sorry, I'll come back to that. I'll have a look back through the slides. But the questions were around, they were framed around generally around non-examples. So what was their experience generally? So do they generally know about about non-examples? Then it was, do they know about them in specific contexts around pedagogy? So just generally in pedagogy. So for example, if we're looking at animals, what is an elephant? What is a non-elephant? So, you know, well, is an elephant pink, for example, something, you know, that kind of. And then the majority of the questions focused in much more carefully on mathematical concepts. So like you said, I was really interested in 2 parts really, which was their content knowledge, was how it related to the maths curriculum, and in particular around pedagogy and assessment. So how confident and what their knowledge was of using non-examples in terms of the content of the curriculum, but also assessing it as well. And the conversations that I want to have with the students and when they come back is around that, how they utilize these non-examples in their pedagogy and in their assessment practices. and around how that's developed their subject knowledge, their content knowledge, and also intra-mathematical connections. So can they see, is there an impact from non-examples on students bringing together different aspects of mathematics, for example? That's kind of one of the things that I want to look at. So, but again, I mean, I'm happy to share the kind of data as well if people want to have a look at it as well. But and when they come back, each participant had a unique code, so I'll be able to marry up and see if there's been any difference between pre-intervention and placement and post-intervention and placement. So I'm going to have a look at that as well.
So whilst it's loading, I'll just introduce myself. So I'm Christina Turner. I've taught maths in secondary schools for over 20 years, really loved it. I'm now the maths PGC lead at Leeds Trinity University, but I'm brand new. I've only been there just over a year. I actually took over from Catherine. So Catherine used to be the maths PGC lead. So yeah, I just wanted to mention as well at this point that we're just starting out on our research as a big group, and the research is being funded by West Yorkshire Maths Hub. So I just wanted to thank them right at the start before passing back over to Catherine.
Hi there. So as Christina said, I'm Catherine Bell. I used to be the Maths PGC tutor at Leeds Trinity. I would like to say I've gone on to do far more exciting things, but it's the early career framework and MPQ, so I'm not quite so sure. Anyway, Christina kindly invited me to join in this project, so we're sort of like going to proceed with this together for the end of the year. Okay, we've also got some other researchers in our group. It's really nice because we've got a spread across primary and secondary. There's also a mixture of routes into teaching. So we've got a mixture of provider-led, the like traditional university way. We've got some school direct and we've got some skits. And together we're going to form this sort of Yorkshire Maths Hub ITT community group.
Great. So as I was saying, we're right at the start of our research as a group. We're all super excited about it. And basically what we're interested in is adaptive teaching. We know adaptive teaching is really challenging, even for really experienced teachers. So what we want to do is look at how we can design activities and resources to best support our ITTs to learn how to adapt their teaching in the classroom. Thanks, Catherine. So why do we want to do this? Well, we know that adapting teaching is, it's really hard. It's a real challenge. And there's lots of things at the moment that we think have caused some confusion around adapting teaching. So for instance, traditionally, I think if you can just flash up the next bullet point, Catherine, if possible. So yeah, traditionally, differentiation has been thought about as perhaps different activities given to students based on their perceived ability. So for instance, it might have been that certain students would have been given red questions, other students might have been given amber ones, and other students might have been given green ones. And we also know that many of our initial teacher trainees have experienced differentiation in that way. And then that influences on their thought processes on how best to meet the individual needs in the classroom. In addition to all of this, there's also been this big move towards the mastery approach, where a real core principle of this is that all pupils broadly progress at the same pace. And the EEF report in 2015, which evaluated mathematics mastery, I don't know if you know that programme, it evaluated that, and it basically pointed out the tension between this idea of broadly keeping your students together, working at the same pace, whilst also meeting the needs of, say, your lower attainers or your higher attainers. So there's real tension around how do you do this when you've got that mastery approach. And finally, I think there's one more bullet point maybe. Yeah. We've also had this subtle shift in language, which hasn't really been flagged up, I think, anyway. Definitely in my teaching career, we've always talked about differentiation, but now very commonly the language of adaptive teaching is being used. And I just genuinely think, and it's not just in IT initial teacher training, I genuinely think there is some confusion in education at the moment about how do we still keep meeting the needs of all of our children whilst we're teaching in that mastery approach, And are we talking about our differentiation and adaptive teaching the same thing? Yeah, so that's why we're so interested in all of this. And finally, as I was saying, it is just really hard anyway. We're talking about experienced teachers. It's hard for them too. Thanks, Catherine. So as a group, we've done some research about adaptive teaching, and the way that we've been thinking about adaptive teaching is the idea that there's this stimulus in the classroom that the ITTs or the teachers notice, and once they've noticed that stimulus, they then interpret it, and then there's some form of teacher response or teacher action. So that's how we're thinking about adaptive teaching, that is very much a response to a stimulus. So, for example, it could be that a child is slow to start their work, the teacher notices that, interprets it, and then something happens as a result. And there's a key paper that we've been using, this 2022 paper, which is basically a review of all of the literature on adaptive teaching in maths education. And you can see that it reflects this cycle of there being a stimulus and then teacher interpretation and then some form of action. But what we're really interested in is this box right in the middle of all of this. So this box here, I think if you click, Catherine, the red box might even come up to highlight it. Yeah, so yeah, these are basically the teacher factors, the affordances and barriers that mediate the relationship between interpretation of the stimuli and then what the teacher actually does. Now, our research is going to focus on the teacher factors specifically. Now, obviously, we're working with initial teacher trainees, so we know actually that their knowledge and their experience is pretty limited. So what we're super interested in are the initial teacher trainee beliefs and how they might mediate what's going on between interpretation and action. Thanks, Catherine. So what we've decided to do is split our overarching question into 4 sub-questions. The first 2 questions basically being about beliefs. So we're going to really dig into the ITT's beliefs. And then question 3, Catherine, and question 4, we're then basically going to look at what impact has our tuition, so these resources that we're going to design, what impact has that had on how the ITTs are then able to adapt their teaching in the classroom? And then finally, we're going to revisit the ITT beliefs and see if all the work that we've done this year has nudged any of those beliefs slightly. So that's basically, yeah, our research project.
So how are we going to do this? Well, each of the Maths ITT leads, so as I say, there's that spread across programme and primary and secondary, they've already recruited 2 participants. So it was done through an open invitation to the entire cohort, and then the participants were selected by use of a random number generator. We've already administered Swan's questionnaire that Christina was referring to about the beliefs, the 2006 paper, and we're currently in the process of conducting a semi-structured interview to find out about trainee beliefs regarding mastery and adaptive teaching. So once all this is in February, we hope to all meet as our community group, and we're going to have a full day together to review the data and to consider ways of providing support on adaptive teaching for trainee teachers. So this might be through giving the trainees discussion prompts, or asking them to undertake placement observations with very specific prompts, or even by asking them to write in a reflective journal to record what they've noticed in the classroom, how they interpret it, and then respond to it. So our participants will then be observed. So we will, as sort of the leads, go in to school and observe that particular participant with a focus on adaptive teaching. And then finally, the participants will be given the same questionnaire. So they'll revisit that questionnaire about their beliefs, hopefully sort of May, June, obviously before they finish the course, and see if there's any been shifts or any changes in their understanding and beliefs. And then at some point we will analyse and evaluate and hopefully get a paper out there.
Yeah, so when we just thought that you might be interested a bit more in how we're going to find out about their beliefs. So we've already done the initial questionnaires, which have been great. So we've used the tool that Swan designed in 2006. So Catherine, if you don't mind just clicking up the first question in that. So to begin with, we asked our trainees what they believed about school mathematics. And the idea is that they split 100% between those three statements, and then each of those statements basically relates to some kind of teaching orientation, which I'll talk about in a minute. So there's question 1, school mathematics is, and then if Catherine you don't mind clicking question 2, which is their beliefs around learning mathematics, they do the same thing, splitting the 100% over the three statements, and then they do the same with teaching mathematics. And then basically, because each statement links to an orientation, they then take the average of the percentages across each question. And if you can click on Catherine, they then get an idea of which orientation might lean more towards. So the orientations that the questionnaire links to are these three teaching orientations. So transmission, where it's much more kind of teacher centered, discovery, where it's focused more on exploration and reflection, and then perhaps more of a connectionist orientation, which is more focused on that interpersonal activity between the teacher and the student. So why is this super important? If you don't mind clicking on again, Catherine. It's super important because actually we know that teachers that lean more towards a connectionist orientation are more likely to be able to adapt their teaching, because they're more likely to notice what the students are saying and what they're doing, and that allows them then to interpret that, and it informs what they then do in a lesson. So beliefs are really important in terms of adaptive teaching and whether teachers are more likely to adapt. Thanks, Catherine.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes left, so I think we should be fine, shouldn't we? Okay, so as we're saying, we're in this process of doing these semi-structured interviews at the moment with our participants. And the first question really is to gauge their thoughts on a key principle of mastery, that pupils broadly progress through each topic at the same pace. Okay, that's a fundamental idea of mastery. Remember, we've got primary and secondary students here. So we also want to know about the strategies trainees already use to identify pupil needs in lessons. And this will hopefully definitely help us plan that tuition, that intervention we're going to do to support the trainees to learn more about their adaptive teaching and techniques that they can use in the classroom. Following on from this, our question focused on what trainees believe that they should do as a result of finding out how their pupils are getting on during their lesson, you know, undertaking that formative assessment. So whether the pupils are struggling or indeed grasping concepts rapidly. We are also exploring what they might do if an individual is struggling, or if a group of pupils are struggling, or in fact the entire class, and asking them about what they would do at that point. And then we are going to do a lesson observation. So we are going to visit each participant in skill just once with watch them teach. You know, they'll be really towards the end of their trainee programme by that point. So hopefully confidence, and we're absolutely fine with that. We're going to focus on the observation on the teacher actions which occur in response to that stimuli that we refer to in that 2022 paper. And hopefully that will sort of like inform some prompts or scaffolding for our observation. So there you go, there, the idea of that stimuli there and ideas. And finally, we're going to give all trainee participants the questionnaire again to see if their beliefs have moved on, been a shift in their beliefs. And these will be plotted on a triangular grid. And this is the example from Swan's research in 2012, sort of like, you know, where did it be before intervention and after intervention. I think there was quite a number, I think there's like 56 teachers that undertook this, but we're going to do the same thing for our participants and see whether there's been a shift in this belief system. And that's roughly where we are with the timeline. So as Christine has said, we are still sort of like, you know, towards the start of the project. We've signed people up, we've done the questionnaire, we're in the process of doing the structured interviews. We're about to meet in late February to put the materials together for the intervention. We will then put the intervention in place. Then we'll go out to schools and do the lesson observation. Then we will grab the trainees before they go off and finish the programme and undertake the questionnaire again. And then hopefully we'll have some time to analyse and evaluate and do a debrief of our findings as a group. So we hope you found this interesting. It's been a steep learning curve already, I think, for Christina and I I hope it's prompted your own thinking about adaptive teaching and very much that difference between that and differentiation. And now we're just open to questions.
Thank you, Catherine and Christina. A very interesting presentation. We look forward to some results in the near future. Okay, so now, if you have any question, please hands up so I can monitor the Q&A session. Okay, so Matt.
Thank you. I'm sorry to bag the first slot again. I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much. And interestingly, I'm also using Swan's model and the tripartite graphs for my PhD work. So I just wondered if you could tell me, what activities are you doing, and are you trying to move people towards a connectionist approach? So what are the actual things you're doing to try and lead to that shift? Thank you.
Yeah, I guess that's the key big question, isn't it? So what we wanted to do as a group is actually use the information that we get back from the semi-structured interviews and the beliefs questionnaires in order to inform our activity design. So we've not yet designed that. We have got a little bit of feedback from the from a bit of data already, but in our minds at the moment, where we definitely, just from the research, we know that we want to design activities that really get them to reflect on lessons that they see, but also reflect on lessons that they do. So we know that we probably need to design something that perhaps mentors or host teachers can use to reflect on specific aspects of adaptive teaching with the trainees after they've observed lessons. We know that that might be one part of it. We've also been thinking about perhaps things like a reflective journal for the ITTs, but then also we're going to design a half-a-day input session where the trainees are going to use discussion prompts and perhaps watch snippets of lessons. But yeah, that's our day in February, and we're going to spend that day planning it. So yeah, a lot of work still to be done. But we're all pretty, well, as you can tell, yeah, we are all pretty excited about it. And it's great to be able to collaborate and work together as a group, particularly across primary and secondary. But thank you for your question. It's, yeah, interesting you're using Swan too.
Yeah, really fascinating. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you, Matt. So any more questions? Okay, for Lorraine.
Sorry, it's following a pattern because I think I went second last time as well. Thank you very much. So interesting. Would love to be doing it with you. I just want you to talk about beliefs as a factor. I just wondered how much subject knowledge, mathematical content knowledge, PCK, but also horizon knowledge. I'm quite interested in that, like the ability to assess and think about what happens next. If they haven't got that knowledge, are they going to be able to do adaptive teaching in the way that you're looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did think, well, we did think about assessing subject knowledge, pedagogical knowledge. You're absolutely right. All of that absolutely does have an impact. And actually, literally due to time constraints, I guess. And yeah, we just decided to focus on beliefs because yeah, we just couldn't do everything. But you're absolutely right in that. And actually, the participants are going to have be at different stages in terms of their knowledge. Honestly, I've never heard of the term horizon knowledge before, so that's brilliant because it's something that I can go away and look up. So
Yeah.
thanks for explaining it. But absolutely, that sounds super interesting and definitely something that would mediate that. Yeah, the interpretation to actually responding, but even the interpretation itself, you could do a whole study on that because obviously with trainees, you know, how do they interpret these stimuli? Do they interpret it in a way that leads to an appropriate response as well? So yeah, I think we just had to strip it back a bit, and that's, yeah, we'd considered how to assess content knowledge and pedagogical knowledge, and in the end we just decided that it was way too much for this study.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We
Okay.
definitely knew it was a factor, and it will vary. Will the strategy they use or the reaction, depending on the content knowledge? It definitely will, won't it?
Yeah.
But
It'll
it
be
was a case of,
interesting, won't it,
yeah,
when you
yeah,
pan
yeah.
this out? I'll look
Yeah,
out for the
but
research again as well. Thank you so
absolutely.
much.
No
Thank
worries.
you.
Okay, thank you. So our last question is from Sarah.
Hi, thank you. I was just trying to follow Lorraine's pattern from the last one to add myself in there. You mentioned about the questionnaire from Swan, and am I right in thinking that you're using both secondary and primary teachers? That's what you said. So the Swan questionnaire, I believe, was designed with the secondary maths teachers in mind, and there's obviously quite a difference in terms of a variety of things around the, I suppose, the knowledge and the kind of experience and so on and so forth with primary and secondary. I wonder if you had any thoughts about using that questionnaire with primary and how applicable it is in terms of the questions.
Yeah, that's such a great question as well. Yeah, I kind of almost wish that we'd done this presentation before we actually started the research. So yeah, honestly, Sarah, as well, and both Catherine and I come from a secondary background, and yeah, we had a pre-meeting with obviously the whole group, and they looked at the questionnaire and they felt that it would be appropriate for their trainees, and they were very happy to deliver that with their trainees. But I absolutely take your point, and it's going to be interesting when we actually start reviewing that data and unpicking it to see if there has been a real difference in how primary trainees have responded to that questionnaire compared to secondary trainees. I know definitely that the primary colleagues have been very happy in the response from those questionnaires, that the trainees were able to fill it in and all the rest of it. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see if there's a difference.
But I also think really with Maths Mastery being in a way as successful as it is in primary, and it is, you know, its outreach is greater, isn't it, in terms of primary than secondary. I think the idea certainly of connectionists, as much as they might not realising they're doing it, there is a real push in Maths Mastery. So if they're in a school that undertakes Maths Mastery, they might be more au fait with it than we think they're going to be fair, despite, you know, the system being designed for secondary. So yeah, we'll have to just wait and see. It's going to be interesting.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so well, firstly, can I just say thank you for inviting me to present today. It's a real privilege to be able to do that and to talk about the research that stimulated the article that's in Research in Maths Education that's cited at the bottom of the screen there. So, I mean, the title gives quite a lot of information about what this study is all about, and the first thing I want to just to talk about it is the focus on mixed attainment mathematics, because that was key to what I wanted to explore, and there are several reasons for that, and I don't want to. We could spend a long time talking about mixed attainment versus sort of the standard kind of ability group structures in mathematics, but some of the key things for me was that the kind of wanting to explore the potential of mixed attainment grouping because of the wealth of research that talks about the problematic nature of what we might call ability grouping. And I like I say, I won't go massively into that, but there's plenty of research that suggests that structure is problematic for a range of reasons. And some of that is on the screen there. So it's about our practices in grouping children, disadvantaged particular pupil groups, the whole notion of ability and what it means and conflating that with attainment, then the diet that children typically receive in a standard ability grouping structure, and the negative impact that all of that might have on low attainers' self-confidence and learner identity. So there's some powerful reasons to explore something different. But then when you look at for research into what mixed attainment, what the benefits might be, they typically tend to be couched in terms of what the lower attainer can gain from working with a higher attainer. So the lower attainer might gain from more sophisticated reasoning or high quality interaction. And all of that seemed to me to miss out what the lower attainer might contribute to the partnership or the group activity. And then there's other things that make this idea that being helped is the reason for mixed attainment grouping, because being helped isn't always helpful if you don't know what kind of help you want, or the help you get isn't what you needed. So I felt the idea of mixed attainment as a vehicle for supporting lower attainers didn't really get at maybe what was possible, and didn't really get at the full story. And I wanted to see the lower attainer as really valuable and an active agent in the mathematical thinking that was being engaged with in the task that children were going to be working on. And there's a very small amount of research. It's not always all class-based that suggests that where you've got mixed attainment partnerships, higher attainers benefit as well as lower attainers benefiting. There's some work coming out of New Zealand from Anthony and Hunter that talks about the whole class benefiting from a mixed attainment structure, because it changes everything in the setup of mixed attainment of mathematical activity. It changes what teachers believe children can do, and it changes what pupils believe they can do. But we still have this gap really in research in terms of saying, well, what actually is going on in a mixed attainment group or partnership that will enable us to be more authoritative about the benefits and the challenges of mixed attainment working. So that was some of the background to the decision to focus on mixed attainment. But then the construct that I wanted to work with was the construct that sometimes might be described as awareness, sometimes might be described as noticing. And again, I don't want to spend too long trying to tease out the difference between noticing and awareness, although we can just maybe accept that they're related constructs. But the work I was wanting to do was trying to build on ideas of, I think these ideas come from Gattegno, and John Mason and Sue Johnston-Wilder wrote about this some time ago, this idea of our natural capacity to identify similarity and difference, to choose to stress some features and ignore others, so that we're sifting all the time the stimuli that come into us, into our vision and our ears and our senses generally, to try to, or not always consciously, but sifting things to make decisions about where we focus our attention. And I wanted to build on this as an idea that noticing, which John Mason describes as the movement or shift of attention that may be conscious and deliberate, but may not be conscious or deliberate. It may just be something has grabbed your attention and resulted in a shift in where your attention is focused. This is where noticing comes from, this idea that we become aware of something that we weren't previously aware of. And this seemed to me to be a construct that was accessible to everybody, and of course this, other people have written about this as well, that this is something that everybody can do. And so it seemed to me to try to plan mathematical activities based on their potential for promoting or provoking noticing meant that there was a level playing field to start with, and what the higher attainers and lower attainers might be able to engage with. Everybody can notice, and that was key to what I was trying to look at. Everybody can notice, so let's start with that. And then a small amount of research that starts to say, well, actually noticing is important for reasoning. What you can't reason with something if you haven't noticed it. And so there's something that suggests that noticing, you might see it as a precursor to reasoning, you might see it as an inherent part of reasoning, but there's a connection there, that you can't reason with something if you haven't noticed it in the first place. So using Lobato's work, I came up with my own definition of mathematical noticing, which was then what you've got on the screen there, the detection of mathematical features, relations or processes. So I was looking in the research for things that children were noticing. So there's a huge methodological challenge in that, which some of you may be thinking about already. Sorry, that looks a bit small at the bottom of the screen there. That what we notice, and I've got what pupils notice, but what any of us notice is not necessarily publicly available. What we notice is often, we may make, we can only see pupils' response to that. So I notice something, and there may be a gesture or a spoken response, or there might be an action that's a result of that. So in terms of observing, and this is kind of, again, key part of the title that I shared at the beginning of the session, this is about close observation that's trying to access something that isn't necessarily publicly available. So the close observation is trying to access the observable response to noticing. And that, in terms of how we might research, means that we're inevitably making inference, because I wasn't talking to the pupils about what they noticed, I was observing what they did and what they said. So this idea of noticing only being partially accessible impacted both on the research design and obviously on the method of analysis. So let me talk to you for a short while. I do need to keep an eye on the time because I have a tendency just to keep talking. So the research design was impacted. How big is that? Can you see that diagram on the left-hand side? On my screen, it's quite small. Okay, it's a bit small. Okay, sorry about that. It's I'm trying to present something that was portrait onto a landscape style slide. If you're familiar with an action research style approach to research design, then you'll be familiar with this sort of structure. This was very closely allied to that. It was, I mean, I described it as an education design research, but its cyclical nature has a lot of parallels with action research. So I worked with 3 primary class teachers, 2 in year 6 and 1 in year 4. They were all experienced and confident teachers. They were actually former participants of our maths specialist teacher programme that some of you may be aware of, that was stimulated from the Williams Review back in 2010, and the aim was then to have maths specialist teachers in every primary school. So these were people that had come through that programme, and they agreed to work with me on this project. I'm describing it as a researcher-led collaboration. It was very much a collaboration, but it was also led by me. It was my research. I was going to be responsible for the analysis and the writing up of it, but their collaboration was very much in the design of the lessons and the lead of the lessons, so that the class teachers led the lessons in their classrooms. So it was obviously very important that they had a clear understanding and a shared understanding of what we were trying to achieve and at what point the lessons needed to move on. So they collaborated with me all the way through that project. So firstly, having secured ethical consent and all of that kind of business, I recruited the 3 teachers. I made a visit to each teacher to have a sort of a visit to their classroom where the children were able to, I talked to the children about what we were going to do. We set the video cameras up because this was going to be a video-based study, and so there is important, because video can be quite intrusive in a primary classroom. The children were able to play with the video cameras and get behind them, get in front of them, get used to the idea. And because one of the things I was concerned about was that video in the classroom might impact quite significantly on how the children acted, and I don't think it did after a while. I genuinely think it sort of faded into the background, because they did the things that children always do in a primary classroom. They got up and wandered off when they were supposed to be sitting down. They started talking about what they'd seen on the television the night before. They did all of the things that would suggest to me that they were unworried by the presence of a camera. So following that introductory visit, there was then a cycle of planning a lesson, conducting the lesson in each classroom, and then having a workshop meeting with myself and the 3 teachers to review some of the video data, to share interpretation, to review how the lesson had gone, and to plan the next lesson. And that cycle proceeded 3 times, and then we met together for one final time, and then I engaged in the analysis. Throughout, we were trying to focus on mathematical noticing. And by that, I mean, we selected tasks, and I'll show you those in a moment, that we felt had a strong affordances for provoking and promoting mathematical noticing. So there were things to notice. We encouraged the use of inactive representation, the use of Numicon, the use of Cuisenaire, various resources that we thought might help children to see patterns. The teachers' interventions at the tables and through all parts of the lesson kept on referring to, what do you notice? What can you see? What's the same? What's different? What's common here? So the questioning was designed to, again, focus children's attention in the most useful way. And then the children's recording sheets had big speech bubbles saying, what do you notice? Tell me what you notice. Talk to your partner. So there's this, we're trying to just raise the profile constantly through the lesson of what you might notice, but importantly of sharing that noticing. We wanted them to talk to each other about what they noticed. In each classroom, we had close video capture of 2 focused mixed attainment pairs. And those pairs of pupils were chosen by the class teacher. There was one child who was working above age-related expectations and one child who was working below age-related expectations. They probably weren't at polar extremes. I mean, that may not have been quite so productive, but they were one above and one below age-related expectations. And I've said about that already. Okay, so just to clearly none of this could have happened without the class teachers that I was working with. Their collaboration in terms of planning the lessons, in tailoring the lessons to meet the children's needs in their class, in terms of supporting the interpretation of video extracts in our workshop meetings, of reflecting on how things were going and how we might further enhance pupil noticing, was critical all the way through this. And you know, obviously the opportunity to work in these classrooms was one of the major privileges of the entire project. These were the tasks that we used in the research lessons. Some of them be familiar to you. 3 of them come from Enrich, and the 4th was one that we devised ourselves. I'm going to focus firstly on the Magic V task, and if we've got time, I've got some slides that focus on the one above that, the what numbers can we make task. But all of these are rich with things that children might notice and fit that aim of what we felt was levelling the playing field by offering everybody an opportunity to notice. And you know, classically in all of these, the numbers were not hard. The thinking was the thing that we wanted. The numbers were not the challenge. So many of you will be, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Magic V task, and so I'm not going to spend ages explaining it. But one of these V, the Magic V is the V is an arrangement of 5 numbers, and one of these is a Magic V, and the other one isn't. And if we had more time, I might get you to tell me about that. But well. Can I actually, what I would like to do is ask you what you see. If you try to imagine those numbers all replaced just with, I don't know, A, B, C, D, E, because the numbers are actually irrelevant at this point, but just take either of those and replace the numbers with A, B, C, D, E. Can you just would somebody like to offer what they see? How might they describe how the V is constructed? What do you see? There's 5 circles. How organised?
The 2 lines of the V share a common circle.
The 2 lines of the V share a common circle. Yeah. So you've got A plus B equals C plus D, and then there's E. Yeah. So if on the left hand side we had the 3. Oh, this is hopeless. So I should have made it A, B, C, D, E. We've got a common. The bottom number is shared in. So you've got 2 lines of 3, but the bottom one in each is shared. The V on the left hand side is the Magic V, because both of those lines of 3 add up to the same number. So 3 plus 4 plus 1 is the same as 5 plus 2 plus 1. Whereas the V on the right, it's got the same numbers but arranged differently, and we don't have the same total. So 1 plus 5 plus 2 as the left arm is not the same as 4 plus 3 plus 2 on the right. So what, I don't know who said that, was it Mariam who said that there was a common number in both? That's really key to developing or making progress in this problem. And what was really interesting in the way the children engaged with this was that oh, now hold on a minute, I've just realised that a slide hasn't appeared that should have appeared. Hold on a sec. Okay. Right, never mind. We'll come back to that. Okay. What was interesting about the way children engaged with this was that key understanding that there was a shared number and that impacted on your thinking about the whole problem emerged quite slowly. So to start with, what children were across all pairs, and both across higher attainer and lower attainers, what I was seeing in the way that children were responding to the task was that they were seeing the V as 2 lines of 3 numbers. And the reason that I would say that is that having analysed the video, actually, I'm going to go forward to this because I think this I'll come back to that in a minute. Can you now see a slide that says analysis, 4 stages of 4-stage process? Okay. So I think what I thought I'd move that slide. So building on the idea that noticing is only our response to noticing is the only thing that's publicly available, and that presents a methodological challenge. When I was then analysing what turned out to be close on 23 hours of videotape across all the lessons and all the different pairs of children across all the classes, I needed a really clear way of extracting from the observable events what I interpreted to be the noticing that underpinned them. And the way I did that was to go through what was described as a process of retroductive inference, which essentially asks the question, what must be the case for this phenomenon X to occur and to occur in the way it does? And that means we're starting with the observable, and then from that inferring the thing that underpins it. And the way that I did that then was to take the video recordings and to run them through multiple times, but producing an initial description of activity-bound sections. So those of you who are familiar with primary mathematics classrooms will know that there's a bit where the teacher's talking, and then there's often a bit where the children are working, and then we go back to a whole class thing later on maybe, or some variations of that. And the bit that I was interested in was the bit where the children were working. But even then, when you pare that down, the children are working at something and then the teacher wanders over to have a chat with them. So every time something new happened, I started a new activity-bound section. The children found a solution, recorded it, and then started looking for a new one. Every change of activity was a new section. So the sections weren't all the same length. They were typically about 2 to 3 minutes long, but they described a particular activity that was happening in that period. So from that, I then had sections of video chopped up into 2 to 3 minutes, maybe 4, possibly 5 minutes long, but mostly 2 to 3 minutes. And from that, I then started to look for what I was describing then as the critical sequences, the things that reflected a change in the lower attainer's activity. So I always started, the first critical sequence was always the first sequence of activity after that it was clear the children understood what they were supposed to do. And that was sort of like my baseline in each lesson. And then every time I could see something that reflected a change in what the lower attainers seemed to be doing or engaging, or how they're engaging, that became a critical sequence, because I was then subjecting that to more detailed analysis to establish, well, what was happening there? And at that point, I started to produce transcripts of the speech within the sequence and then tried to then theoretically interpret. But all the way through, the video data remained the most important thing. It never got to the point where the transcript became the data that I was engaging with, because videotape doesn't really work like that. You can annotate this, you can transcribe the speech, but you can't transcribe the detail of activity. You know, she moved the Numicon 4 piece to the right, he moved it to the left. That would be a nonsense. You have to keep going back to the video for that detail of what's going on. So in producing, or in the analysis that I'm started to describe and then jumped forward to this, what I'm explaining in this analysis has come from this process of engaging in refined and more detail in these particular critical sequences of video. So just to go back then to what was happening here. Initially the children were engaging with the V as 2 lines of 3 numbers, and that was evidenced by the fact that they always added up all 3 of the numbers in the lines, and they did them in any particular order. So they weren't always saying, right, the number at the bottom plus the other 2, or the 2 numbers at the top plus the 1 at the bottom. It was fairly random. It was based on what number bonds they spotted and were able to add first. But gradually there was evidence that they did start to see the V as 2 arms plus a shared base number. And more significantly than that, they've started to realise the role of that number in both finding solutions and in identifying then commonalities of what those bottom numbers were. But let's move on again. We'll just move past that slide. But what was key for me was, again, the role of the lower retainer in this, because joyously it was often the lower retainer that made this or that demonstrated this noticing first. So here we've got Mia, who was the lower retainer in a particular partnership, and she's got the cards laid out in front of her in a V, and she's got her fingers on each hand pointing very clearly to the 2 pairs of numbers that make up the arms, and they're the ones she's interested in. Look, 5 and 5. She knows that's a solution. She doesn't even bother to say, and there's another 5 and that makes 10, because she knows that. And her high retaining partner had not done that at that point. That was the first time that happened in that particular pair. And here's another lower retainer in another partnership who's explaining why something isn't correct, because they've made this arrangement, and he's saying, no, look, 5, and he points at the left-hand pair at the top, and that's 6. And again, he doesn't say, and if you add 4 to both of them, 1 makes 9 and 1 makes 10. He doesn't need to say that, because he knows that 5 is not the same as 6, and therefore that can't be a solution. And if we look at, I mean, this is kind of my thinking at the time was about what were they doing? Is it that they're seeing the V differently? And I think the answer to that is yes. But was there also, and this was kind of a conjecture I had at the time, was whether there was also at the same time a shift towards looking for the features of solutions. What makes a solution successful? Is it this, or is one of those ideas enabling the other? Another example then, this was the same child as we saw Joe a moment ago. When they'd finished exploring this activity with number cards 1 to 5, the teachers gave the number cards 2 to 6, and that changes things. It meant that even numbers had to go at the bottom. You've got much of the thinking is the same, but you've got a different set of numbers. And he very quickly, after the experience of using digit cards 1 to 5, he then started to use what he knew already as a way of finding solutions. So he's got the 5 number cards. You can see 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in front of him there. The next thing he did was just pull out the 6 and 3 and made it into 9. And then he looked at the other cards that he had available to him, found another pair that made 9. And at that point, he knew he'd got the right solution. So then he just dragged the 2 in underneath. So his sequencing of the way he was then addressing the activity was built on the noticing that he'd engaged in before. And again, his high retaining partner had not done that at that point. This then became the way to engage, and that's how they started to engage with this particular activity. So what I was seeing all the time in this activity was the lower retainers not just being helped, they were contributing really significantly to what was going on. And there's a further example here then of a lower retainer who's in the classroom. This is a different classroom where the use of Numicon had really been promoted to help them understand why in the set of numbers 1 to 5, why it's only the odd numbers that end up at the bottom. There are no correct solutions for the numbers 1 to number cards 1 to 5, where you could have a 2 or a 4 at the bottom. And their class teacher had really set them the challenge of explaining why that was. And she suggested that they use Numicon to help them. So here on the left, on the picture on the left there, you've got a little picture of a sort of V with 1 and 5 on the left, 2 and 4 on the right, and the 3 is the number that's at the bottom of the V. And in order to really prompt them to think about why it might not work to have a 2 and a 4 at the bottom, the class teacher said, well, look, put the 2 at the bottom and try to explain to me why that can't work. And they looked at this for a long time. Daisy and Jess. Daisy is the lower retainer and Jess is the higher retainer. And Daisy has been spinning Numicon around on her finger. You know, she'd stuck all the lots of Numicon pieces around her little finger and was spinning them round and round, and then suddenly says this, "Oh my God, no, no, no." And then I'll let you read the rest of what she said. If you can. Is it big enough to read? So this idea that actually what was going to be helpful is to add up all the numbers that were left when you if you have the 2 at the bottom and then you try to add up the 1, 5, 3 and 4, that's going to make an odd number, and therefore you can't split that into 2 even pairs to make the 2 arms. It's brilliant. And again, the lower retainer got to that. And so throughout, there were multiple examples throughout all of the activities that we did. Can I just check how much time I've got left? Because I don't know whether I've got time to go into. I haven't. I've got about 2 minutes left, haven't I?
You can go till 15:15, I think.
So
Yeah,
how
so
much?
5 minutes.
Another 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Oh, then we might just have time to do a little bit, have a look at another lesson, but it'll be a little bit quick. So throughout this lesson, in all of the classes, I was in 3 classes and 2 pairs of children in each class. The lower retainers weren't always finding everything first, but there was enough examples of lower retainers contributing significantly to the thinking that was going on for me to challenge this idea that lower retainers benefit from working with higher retainers because they can be helped. It was frequently, it was the other way around. If I just go very quickly to this other task that we did, another task is again an enriched task that some of you may be familiar with. And this task, you've got number bags and you've got multiple 1s, 4s, 7s and 10s, and you can choose any 3 numbers from any 3 bags. You can choose 3 numbers from one bag or 2 from one and 1 from another, and you have to add them up, and then you tell us what the answer is. And if you're not familiar with this, I'll tell you the key initial thing is that anytime you do that, you're going to get a multiple of 3. 3 10s, 2 10s, and a. Sorry, you're not going to get a multiple. Hold on a sec. You're going to get you're going to get a multiple of 3 as the answer. So 2 10s and a 7, 3 10s, a 1, a 4, and a 7. They're all going to be multiples of 3. And back to Joe again. He's the lower retainer working with higher retainer Ash. They've tried to work out why that's the case, and they're working on a conjecture that was common across all the classes, that there was something to do with the fact all the numbers are multiples of 3 because you picked 3 of them. And so the conjecture was then, if I picked 4 of them, then I'd have a multiple of 4. And if I picked 2 numbers, I'd have a multiple of 2. Joe works through that in his head and starts to explain to Ash that conjecture doesn't hold true if you only pick 2 numbers, because you won't always get a multiple of 2. So Ash has had this conjecture that it's 3 numbers and therefore 3 times table very quickly. And then the numbers in brackets on the 3rd and 4th bullet are the number is the time of the video. So at 10 minutes 22 seconds in the video, Ash has made that conjecture. It's only 11 minutes and 4 seconds, so kind of 36 seconds later, 38 seconds later, that Joe is challenging that conjecture. It hasn't taken him long. He paused, he looked, he thought, and then he articulated, and he was absolutely right. And if I proceed with other examples, again, here's a lower retainer we haven't met before, Rose, working with Hannah, who is they're working on, well, if the numbers that you get when you add 3 of them together are all multiples of 3, what is it about the numbers that we started with then? And if you recall, we started with 1, 4, 7 and 10, and yes, they are all 1 more than a multiple of 3, and Hannah is having some trouble with that. So she says, yeah, 4, so 1 less is 3, 7, 1 less is 6, but the 1, how is 1 more than a multiple of 3? She could not see that at all. But Rose, in the 3rd line down, then says, If it was one less, it would be 0 and there'd be nothing there, and that would be a multiple of 3. And then she recalls the way they do the times table chart in their class, which is to start with 0 every time. So Rose is the one, the low attainer, who identifies that if you take all of those numbers, 1, 4, 7 and 10, they're all one more than a multiple of 3. It's not just the 4, 7 and 10 that are one more than a multiple of 3, so is the 1. The use of Numicon was key in this lesson. Numicon helped these children in their noticing of this essential idea that every time you add 3 numbers, you're going to get a multiple of 3. And maybe the picture in the middle is the one to start looking at. They were underneath is a 4, a 7 and a 10. If you're unfamiliar with Numicon, the Numicon 4 is this kind of green colour that's been covered up with a Numicon 3, but there's one piece left over showing that the 4 is actually one more than that multiple of 3, in the same way that 7 is one more than 2 3s, and the 10 is one more than 3 3s. And the children realised that because there were then 3 kind of leftover bits, if you push those together, you could fit another 3 on it. And again, I mean, I think that's really quite a sophisticated way to explore this. And again, it was Mia who we met looking at the Magic B task, who identified that if you pushed them together, you could fit another Numicon 3 there, and that meant that the total was going to be a multiple of 3.
So there was some. Please.
Sorry.
Just 1 minute, please,
Okay.
and then we'll have some time for discussion.
Yep,
Sorry
perfect.
to stop you because it's so fascinating.
No, that's fine. I think we're just about done. So across all the lessons and across all low attainers, these children were working with higher attaining partners. And there's an interesting dynamic that I think is also worth talking about, which is that gradually over time, the lower attainers were listened to more by their higher attaining partners. The noticings and the ideas they contributed were increasingly valued by the children that they were working with. And that wasn't necessarily the case right at the beginning of the study. But the contributions they made that were visible because of this close observation were used to challenge conjecture, to move thinking along, and to provide really vital insights at various points in the lesson. And so I think I conclude by just coming back to this idea of close observation. None of this was really visible in the cut and thrust of the classroom because you're trying to see so much. And actually, when your children are working in a partnership, one child has an idea and then very quickly that idea is owned by them both. And that's absolutely right. So it should be. But the close observation enabled me to see often where that idea had come from and the role of the lower attainer in that. And then there's this accessibility of mathematical noticing and how important I think it is in terms of planning activities that allow opportunities for noticing. And then I think that there's so much more to be done about looking at mixed attainment working and what the opportunities, but also the challenges that presents for all of us who are doing that.
Academy is literacy and leading literacy and what that looks like across all the departments. So the disciplinary literacy in maths and the vocabulary that we use. And the key competitive drive is, can we reduce the gap between English and mathematics? And reviewing some research, Temple and Doe's emphasized the importance of collaborating with the other departments just to ensure that there's this consistency and what literacy looks like across the school. So that's my rationale behind this study, and really why I'm here with you guys today is just to be among experts like yourself. I'm new to the research world. I started off with action research, looking and making changes in my own classroom. This year is my first year going into the official research world. So I'm really just here to learn and to accept any critique, what you've seen, any things that I can improve. So why disciplinary literacy? It's come up quite a lot in the past few years. If we look at the national curriculum, it really stands out when it comes to the reasoning context, which is normally assessment objective 2 when we're questioning teachers, what type of questions you're using for students, can students communicate mathematically? And also when we look at exam boards, when we look at inspections by Ofsted, we really see that students are struggling, especially in maths, based on their language skills. Can they interpret information? Can they communicate that information verbally and internally? And does that help them to reason? And if they cannot reason in the maths classroom, then can they engage within the maths classroom, or do they just aspire to one area in terms of fluency? Now, my main aim for this study is really to just improve the teacher's perspective and how that can actually improve engagement. So do mathematics teachers take responsibility on disciplinary literacy? Do they know what that is? Or is that the English teacher's job? Do they know the key components of disciplinary literacy? And do they have any tools within their pockets to support engagement when they're using disciplinary literacy in mathematics? So one of the key models that I found was the Reading House model. Now, for what I've seen of maths teachers is they see this as an English teacher remit, where it's the English teacher's job to teach the students how to read, how to write, how to have comprehension. So what I've seen, especially in my experience as maths teachers, we expect the students to be able to come and have perfect and proficient reading comprehension when we give them mathematical literacy. Right? And my key questions are they choosing activities to support students how to read? Reading as a mathematician is completely different to reading as an English scholar. Do they know the key vocabularies? Can they comprehend? Can they write? Can they respond? Do they know what command words means within their space of mathematics? So the Reading House is really what I shared with the maths teachers. And what we came up with is some literacy activities. Now, I went to a CPD by the National Literacy Trust, looking at how do we improve disciplinary literacy in maths. That sparked my workshop with the maths teachers within my school and some from our multi-academy trust. And here we have two different types of activities. So the first type of activity we came up with was comparing and contrasting, right? So this activity allows the students to reason what is the same and what is different between, in the first section on the top left, you can see algebraic terms. Are these like terms? A lot of students can say yes or no, but can you actually explain and justify why? So we both can see 2's and we both can see x's. Are the positions where the 2's and the x's are important? What do they mean? What does the 2 on the left-hand side mean? What does the 2 on the right-hand side mean? Does that change the meaning of the actual term? And then just their perspectives on what's the same, what's the difference in the bottom left-hand side. And can they make comparisons to what they can see? And can they use the vocabulary, what they have already? If we move on to the right-hand side in terms of interpretation, when they see words in maths, what does that mean to them? Now, I also run a work group, year 5 to 8 continuity with Maths Hub. And what we've seen, especially with that transition between Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3, is there's a lot of assumptions students have or small tricks they have to take them through in maths. And what we see is a lot of students are really confident in maths when they come into year 7 because they have all of those tips and tricks to help them to actually get the grades or make that progress. However, when they get to Key Stage 3 and we're really challenging, can you speak and can you interpret as a mathematician? This is where they fall over. So triple, what does that mean? Does that mean to add 3? Multiply by 3. Another one I normally see with the year 7s is when we're multiplying, they will just tell you to just add a 0 on the end, especially if you're multiplying by 10. So activities like this really helped teachers to really pick out, do students actually know what these words mean? And how did this lead to engagement? Well, what I found was students were a lot more confident in the classroom, especially when we had what we do in iSchool, we do I do, we do, you do, and we have think, pair, share activities. Students had the literacy to discuss it with their partners. A lot of the times, and this does not depend on attainment in terms of set 1 and set 2 or set 4 or the nurture classes. We'll see a lot of students will say, oh, I know what to do, I can't explain why. And the activity on the right really gave them that language to interpret what these things mean and how I can use that in mathematics. Now, moving on to a second model. That model really came from the 5 big ideas in maths. Now, the NCETM is really pushing this, but the key driving force is the maths hubs in the local areas. So the maths hubs will share this with the teachers in their areas. And a key section I want to look at is languages and representation, and how does that improve literacy? Now, I chose these 3 questions because I used these 3 questions with the teachers, and the teachers use these with the year 9 students. And year 9 students that was perceived to have attainment in standard form, how did that change, and how did their engagement change when we introduced literacy, when we introduced worded questions? What I found was quite a lot of the students actually, first question, they said, actually, I know what 6,005,200 looks like. I'm going to write that down in maths, and then I'm going to do the standard form. So they could interpret that. But then when it came to the reasoning questions, did we have a model to support them with that reasoning, especially question number 3 with the patient? Now, they can read it, they can interpret that, but how does the interpretation help them to actually access the question? So a model that we're using a lot more now is the FRAIL model. Now, with the FRAIL model, it allows teachers and students to improve their metacognition. So with teachers, it's a nice toolkit they can give to students, where if you have this toolkit and we use it alongside our questions, we can see examples on non-examples, but the key area here is the characteristics. Does this question fit the characteristics of standard form? How do I decide this question is even standard form? And this was the key tool that we use the FRAIL model in terms of improving reasoning. And in terms of improving reasoning, then we were able to improve engagement. So then now, if we put this question next to the standard form model, here, especially with our set 1 students, or our high priority attaining students, they were able to now attempt the question. They were now able to reason the question. And when we showed it as a think, pair, share model, where you can discuss this with your partners, then we saw students being able to actually form the question and change it from the English into mathematical representation of standard form to then answer the question. And these are just the key barriers that I've personally found with the students at my school, despite their attainment, which is a key barrier for their engagement in classroom and also their attainment in classroom. And the standard form model using the standard form concept using the FRAIL model was just quite eye-opening to teachers to see, actually, if I could create or provide literacy models for my students, they actually now have a tool in their toolbox to be able to pull out whenever they come across these questions in terms of language. Now, key benefits, what I say from the FRAIL model I have at the bottom, you can compare the examples, non-examples. Students can actually very quickly say, actually, this is not in standard model form. And then we ask them to justify. How we ask them to justify, they will discuss the characteristics of that. It enables them to think critically. They now understand the meanings of these words, and they can make those visual connections between the questions that they see in their exam. So what does that look like now on my research journey, these disciplinary literacy tools? So from my workshop last year and my observation of the engagement with my students, in December, I went through the literature review to see the different models and how we can use that to support and see what previous researchers have been using. And my next steps would be to first issue the questionnaire to my teachers, seeing their perspectives of what literacy looks like in maths. A lot of maths teachers, in my experience, have been very focused on, as long as I get the results, that's important. But it's also important to make sure that our students, we're prepping our students to be mathematicians, and not just to be able to, when they get to sixth form, which a lot of sixth form teachers, if I have any here, might find a bit frustrating, is when students say, oh, I know what to do, I just can't explain it. And it's like, but you must be able to explain it, to demonstrate, to be able to show that you can justify your answer. And at my school, we do the OCR MEI, and we have the big comprehension section. And this is the area where we see students really, really find very challenging when they're not able to be literate in mathematics. In March, I'm going to go and do my observations. Following my observations, some interviews. In April, I'll collect my data and analyze what I've seen. And hopefully by May, I'll be able to make some conclusions and see the most effective and efficient tools we can use in maths and the key models that researchers have found in maths that can support engagement. And hopefully after the exams, our students that were selected, we can see if this had an impact on their exams next year and if this follows through with the other students to come. So that's it from me. Thank you. Do I have any questions?
Wow, that's perfect, Kadeen. I was just saying you had 2 minutes to go, and there you go. You're finished. Brilliant. Thank you so much. So questions, comments. Amber.
That was really interesting because now I'm a teacher trainer of FE teachers. I have many trainees who teach ESOL students maths.
Okay.
And one of the problems they have, and these are people that have come here with high levels of education previously from where they've fled or wherever they've come, and the problem, and they have to do maths level 2 to enter any kind of education here again sometimes. And the problems that my trainees say they have are the language barriers in maths for these ESOL students to access the mathematics. The mathematics isn't the problem, it's the language. So I know it's sort of slightly different to what you're saying, but that model would be very useful for them, I feel, as well.
Yes. So I'm interested you said that because I found that quite useful with my EAL students because they see it as a form of dual coding, and it's almost like you almost slow the class down because now everyone is learning the language of mathematics.
That's very interesting. Yes.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
So then they find it quite useful because then now we're teaching vocabulary and they learn vocabulary in English so they can make those connections. And I think the sad thing I find is whenever we have EAL students come join, they normally just put them straight in the nurture group. And you'll find that there's a lot of EAL students that are actually quite proficient in mathematics. They're just not able to communicate that. And
Exactly.
once we equal the playing field and we introduce these language activities, then they can learn the language of mathematics along with English. So,
That's
yes,
absolutely brilliant. Would you mind putting your slides in the chat, please?
I can.
And I'll share that with some of my trainees because that's absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant.
Thank you, Amber. And Kadeen, if you can stop share as well, then you get a better, you'll be able to see those of us who've got our cameras on. If other people want to put their cameras on now, that's always a bit nicer when you're asking questions. Thank you. Nancy.
Thanks, Jill. Kay, that was fantastic. It was really, really lovely presentation. Really enjoyed that. And I think you've got a really important topic that you're examining there. And I know you're focusing on Key Stage 3, but Key Stage 2, this is really pertinent as well. And I think it's sometimes where a gap starts to open up between different pupil groups, those that maybe have understood the disciplinary literacy at Key Stage 2 level and those that are struggling. And actually, particularly things like triple, I picked that up because I've seen that before, and actually not much in relation to triple, but actually related to doubling, where children haven't always identified that doubling is the same as multiplying by 2. They kind of, on one level, perform the same operation, but actually haven't actually made that connection internally that actually we're talking about the same thing. So there's some really, really important ideas there, and it'd be really good to hear the final results of this when you finish the study. So I'm kind of wanting to know where you're going to present the outcomes later on, because I'd like to be there.
Oh, thank you. I'll be happy to share. Hopefully, I'll find a platform to be able to share that and invite you guys all on. Thank you.
I also noticed you used, I think Jack's here, and I think you used the same model as Jack used, that I can't remember what it was called.
The FREYA model.
Yeah, so it's really nice to see that being used across 2 different presentations. It's clearly a useful idea.
Oh, that's brilliant, Nancy, because I wasn't in Jack's presentation, so I wasn't aware of that. But when we finish, and this is something to be thinking about now, it's not too late to put things into BERA. That might be a bit of a stretch or you might think it's a bit of a stretch, but there's also what OHAU talked about. So there's the BSRLM New Researchers Day in June, which is another fabulously supportive place to go and present your research, or indeed the standard BSRLM Day conference, as well as the BERA conference. BERA conference have a place where you can present posters, or you can, it might be that there's enough of you interested in a similar thing that you want to see if you can put a symposium together. If not this year, think about it for next year. So thank you. Brilliant. Jack, did you want to come in there?
I just found it really interesting, yeah, and the fact that we both were looking at those models was quite interesting. So that obviously looks like a bit of a theme. So maybe
you could collaborate.
It might be an interesting thing to look at there. Yeah.
Thank you, Jack.
Brilliant, thank you. Other questions or comments? Hi, Fenella.
Hi. Thank you so much for that. I really enjoyed that. Last year, I just completed my master's in storytelling in mathematics, so it links really well. And I found I'm from the primary area of education, but it just really shows the importance of having vocabulary in the mathematics classroom and creating that remit for discussion. And it linked a lot to what we do within the storytelling. So we use a picture book, and then that opens up conversation about the definitions of things that you were talking about. So it was just really nice to see that carrying on into secondary.
Thanks, Vanilla. Thank you.
And it's interesting to me, many years ago when I taught in Camden, it was one of the things we were looking at around transition, particularly around not the focus that you've taken, Kadeen, but more about language support for people learning English as an additional language, and work that was going on there in terms of transition and early support in Key Stage 3. So some of that's out there, I think, somewhere in the resources. Catherine Driver was very much involved in it, and I know there were like Key Stage 3 strategy resources. So there are things out there, and there's probably a lot more recent stuff like that other people will be aware of.
Thank you, Jo.
Is the plan for participants then? How are you going to recruit your participants?
So luckily for me, my school has their own teacher training provider. So I initially started with the teachers at my school, but because we're a part of a multi-academy trust, I really have a bank of teachers that are new, that are eager to see what that looks like in their classroom. So recruitment is a little bit easy on my side.
That's great. Makes it a little bit easier, doesn't it? And it means you're able to kind of get outside your own school as well a little bit.
Yes.
Right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's been really great to be here today, and I've learned so much from lots of different speakers as well. So thank you for having me. My name's Lewis. I'm a postgraduate researcher at the Faculty of Health, Education, Medicine and Social Care at Anglia Ruskin University. And I'm in my final year of my doctoral study. This afternoon, I'd like to give you an overview of my developing educational doctorate research. I've also got some audio clips embedded in my presentation, so hopefully you'll be able to hear those. And if you can't, please do let me know. If there's a silent pause, I'm listening to it, and obviously you can't hear it. So just let me know. My professional context, I'm a deputy head teacher at Kendal Church of England Primary School in Essex. I lead maths across the school, and I'm also the mathematics lead for a subject for an initial teacher training provider. So I deliver their maths content for primary and also secondary partially as well. My research began, as many phenomenological research studies do, with a sense of wonder. My school is a centre of excellence for outdoor learning, and many of our lessons take place outside the classroom, whether it be in our playground, around the school, or within our extensive woodland area as well. As part of the school's leadership team, I spent a great deal of time researching the benefits of outdoor learning, and also helped to develop the school's plan to train teachers and acquire the necessary facilities to make outdoor learning work effectively in our setting. And there's a great deal of research out there that points to outdoor learning as being beneficial for lots of different aspects, whether it be engagement in learning, behaviour, well-being, development of communication skills, and the holistic improvements for our children as well. And I'm also a member of the specialist interest group with BERA, the Nature and Outdoor Learning and Play specialist interest group as well. Outdoor learning in this study can be described as the regular use of outdoor spaces for mathematics lessons. It doesn't refer here to field trips, forest school sessions, or outdoor continuous provision, where maths can occur incidentally, but rather planned lessons led by a teacher just taking place in the outdoor environment. What I noticed in my professional context and practice was that teaching maths beyond the four walls of a classroom felt very different for me as the teacher. The space, sounds, and natural resources all make the experience of teaching maths outside very different with regular classroom practices. However, if it's different for the teachers, what must it be like for the children to learn maths outdoors? What I noticed when I observed children learning maths outside, again, seemed odd. There was something different about the way in which the children engaged with their learning in the outdoors compared when in the classroom. And if I were able to understand the children's experiences, perhaps I'd be able to facilitate effective outdoor learning and pass on the implications of practice and pedagogy to the teachers I lead and the trainee teachers I lecture. This brought me to my research question: how do children experience learning maths in the outdoors? So firstly, it's important to point out the aim of the research was not to produce generalizable findings. Understanding that experiences of the outdoors and mathematics will be unique for every individual is the starting point of this study. I also didn't set out to compare the outdoors with the traditional classroom in a bid to say one is better than the other. This research was simply to glimpse at the lived experience of individual children, to have a better understanding of the pedagogy of outdoor learning and the implications this might have on the mathematical experiences for our children. To do this, I adopted a hermeneutic phenomenology as my chosen methodology. This is a methodology that is not particularly commonly used in mathematics educational research. Phenomenology aims to uncover embodied experiential meanings from participants. This means that researchers engaging phenomenology seek to understand the lived experiences of participants through a specific phenomenon, and in this case, that happens to be outdoor learning of maths. My study is hermeneutic in the sense that I, as the researcher, am interpreting the experiences of the participants. The focus of hermeneutic phenomenology is not on the opinions, attitudes, or views of the participants, although as good as they are to have, but rather the focus here is on the pre-reflective experience as lived. I recruited 5 10-year-olds from my own Year 6 classroom that I teach, and they were the participants for my study. To collect their experiential data, I conducted one-to-one unstructured walking interviews. The interviews drew on art-based methods of data collection as well as vocative exercises to deepen the accounts and the experiential material gathered from the participants. Each of the interviews was also conducted outdoors, and the children were free to guide me to locations where they could better explain how they experienced the learning in the lessons, often taking me to places and saying, when I was here, it was like this for me. And that really helped to understand better the experiences of the children during these lessons. One of the challenges with phenomenological research is there is no method to follow when it comes to data analysis. Therefore, my analysis was a series of hopeful attempts and understanding the experience of the participants. After encountering several dead ends, my data analysis can now be presented in a more straightforward and linear way. I began by self-transcribing the interviews, which had been audio recorded. I then crafted stories of the children's experiences from the data within the transcripts. And when this was complete, I then took each crafted story and began a series of holistic, selective, and detailed reading before engaging in phenomenological thematization and phenomenological writing. We don't really have time to go into the depths of all of those methods at this point. The image you can see on the screen was drawn by a participant during an interview. Whilst it is not part of the data analysis, I have included these drawings in my thesis to illustrate some of the research findings, but this was a way in which to elicit experiential details from the children, so they were able to then draw their experience and either narrate me through their drawing, or I was then able to ask questions about their drawing, which brought out some of their pre-reflective understandings. Following my data analysis, I developed 3 distinct but connected poieses. The term poiesis comes from Greek, and it means to bring something into existence. It's more methodologically suitable than the word findings in most research, because my research illustrates an arrival at a fusion of horizons between my interpretations and what the individuals describe, rather than something which has been discovered that was always sitting there waiting for me to find. The essential essences of connection, enthrallment, and serenity are at the heart of the children's experience of learning maths outdoors. And here's the first audio clip.
I work in a two. Working with someone else in the woodlands is really good because if you're stuck on a question, then they can help you. The same as if they're stuck, you can help them.
My favourite question is on this tree here. It rattles my brain a bit. I can't really think of it on the first or second try. So I keep trying with my partner. They motivate me, so I have motivation. We both give ideas to see if we are doing this bit right or this bit wrong. It gets hard. I get a little annoyed, a bit frustrated. Being outside helps the frustration, and then suddenly I get it. I'm really surprised. I want to scream.
Sometimes you don't have to get along with everyone, but because we're in partners and doing partner work, we're in a thing. We're doing some really good maths and we're doing really good team.
I become aware that if I get stressed, the whole team will get stressed and then it will all crumble.
So firstly here, connection. For the participants, lessons are experienced as individually unique journeys which run in parallel with others in the class. Individuals in the lesson take their own path on that journey, departing, taking a rest, and then rejoining at some point in the future. The outdoors offers participants the ability to choose to work with others and the self-directedness to work independently. Those who choose to work independently seek comfort in the protection they are offered by claiming their own learning space. And it is the availability of space outdoors that allows individuals to spread out and move away from others when needed. However, those who choose to work alone still recognise their experience is ultimately deeply entwined with others around them. The participant's story demonstrates that the outdoor environment provides a place where children are able to work together more easily. There are opportunities for children to leap ahead of each other, and whilst this can become burdensome for some, participants engage in deliberate negotiations for assistance, motivation, and energy without which they would not be able to make progress. Stories reveal that participants have an awareness of their position within the class. They identify groups of others different from themselves. They sometimes are directed to work with others, and this forms a single unit working together to achieve success. Others of the past are encountered through the artifacts they leave behind in this shared learning environment. These enrich this highly relational experience. Because the outdoors is a shared environment, learning is also spilled from the time restraints of individual lessons to children in other classes. The key message here is that lived connections with others are at the heart of the experience of learning maths in the outdoors. Learning mathematics outdoors experienced through complex and dynamic lived relations with others. It is these connections to others that provide support and security when learning becomes challenging, and it is the outdoor environment that enables these deep connections to be established and maintained. Secondly, enthrallment. Participants become enthralled in outdoor learning as they are immersed in the natural environment. This begins with the transition into the outdoors, with participants illustrating how they feel beginning to change.
Whenever these types of things happen, I feel like it's a little journey. We leave the playground. Everybody is trying to get the worksheets down from the trees.
We're working outside.
As we go outside, we're in the forest for maths.
The children develop a sense of pleasure and happiness outdoors, and some are relieved of their sadness and feelings of discomfort. Small details of the objects in nature fill the participants with a sense of awe as the environment gives them permission to begin to unleash their creativity. This is evident through how they see the experience as game-like, and also how they engage with objects through imagination to support them with their learning. The fact that participants feel happy and are able to engage in imaginative play-like learning demonstrates the outdoors provides a safe space for their lessons. The children are transported from the real world into a different environment that acts as a sanctuary for them to learn in. The key message of this poiesis is that creativity is nurtured through the enthrallment and immersion experienced by the participants. And finally, serenity. Learning maths outdoors provides a location where participants are able to be serene. Calm, peacefulness, and a sense of freedom are provided by the natural environment and support the children's sense of safety. The environment enables other pressures to be left behind and gives pupils the ability to try again and persist in their learning.
The person gives me the syrup and then I'm back in action.
It's like the best dream, going and getting ice cream and having a movie night with everyone.
It feels really fun to see them again.
The participant stories reveal that it's the environment which leads them to becoming untroubled by worries and pressures. However, it's important to understand that to be untroubled in this sense doesn't mean to be disengaged or unconcerned about their learning. Participants are more actively engaged in their learning as a result of the untroubledness they experience, and it is this that calls into question our understanding of what active learning may mean. The key message here is through the feelings of freedom, peace, and calm, serenity is found within the outdoor learning environment. This supports the participants in their learning and shelters them from troubling external factors. Looking at the insights gleaned from all three of these essential elements, I've established that natural environment provides a safe location where the participants are able to connect to others, be creative, and be calm. It is through these elements that we come to an understanding that the outdoors can be a learning sanctuary where the children are able to be active in their mathematical understanding. Whilst not yet complete, my research identifies 5 key insights. Firstly, outdoors, children are supported to work in a self-directed manner, choosing to work directly with others through cooperation or alternatively alongside others within an inclusive learning environment. Secondly, the natural environment reduces stress and instills a sense of peace and freedom, which enables children to persist with their mathematics. Also, learning mathematics in the outdoor enhances children's creativity in the way they engage with their learning. The outdoors is also a shared learning space that enables connections beyond lessons so that children may discuss beyond the scope of a session of mathematics the learning that has taken place inside it. And finally, the role of the teacher in outdoor learning maths is not as important as the role of peers and of place. And I go more into that in a slightly different presentation. Each of these insights clearly has implications for practice and pedagogy, and that is currently what I'm working on in my doctoral research. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you. That's yeah, really lovely. Thank you, Lewis. I'm going to give people time to breathe and start to think of questions, and please indicate with the hands up. If you can find that, it's under reactions on the top bar if you want to speak. I'm fascinated by lots of things there, but you talked about hopeful attempts on the way to analysis. And I was hoping that some of those would appear either in your thesis or in other writing, that you're not going to kind of clean them out, you know, out of the way so that it all looks nice and linear.
Yeah, I've taken a lot of time thinking about how to present my thesis, because it really was, or has been and is still, a very windy path with lots and lots of dead ends as well. And I've been clear to explain those as well. I presented a couple of weeks ago at a hermeneutic phenomenological conference basically on those dead ends and what I learned through that. And, you know, when I'm presenting, I have to judge whether to go down those dead ends and explain why I made certain decisions, or just really present how I've actually, the line I have actually taken, because that's not a line that that previously existed and wouldn't necessarily be the same one I would take with different participants, a different research question, different data. It's very much been led by me developing as a phenomenologist, researcher, and also me working with the data I've got.
Thank you. Questions or comments from other people? Nancy, thank you.
Thanks, Jill. That was really interesting, Lewis. Apologies if I missed it because the doorbell rang and I had to go and answer it. But could you say a little bit more about the nature of your outdoor environment and how that shapes and maybe affords and constrains opportunities for particular kinds of mathematical engagement?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're very lucky. We have 3.8 hectares of ancient woodland that's adjoining our school, and we use that very, very extensively. We are a forest school, but actually we have trained all of our teachers in outdoor learning pedagogy in order to be able to deliver the national curriculum beyond the classroom. At the moment, if you come into our school, there'll be lots of people inside the school because of the cold weather, although forest school still takes place and people are outside. If you come to us more in the summer or the autumn term, you hardly see anyone in the classroom, because most of our lessons across all of the curriculum areas take place in the outdoors. And we're a member of the Institute for Outdoor Learning as well, and we deliver one of their courses at our school. So it's very, very deeply embedded. But interestingly enough, when we first started developing our staff's understanding of outdoor learning pedagogy, we introduced it through low stakes curriculum areas such as art or something like that you can perhaps go out and do a piece of outdoor art. And we said to our staff, go out, have a go with a couple of lessons and come back to us. Doesn't matter if it's a complete and utter failure, but come back to us, tell us what you think. And nearly all of them started with a maths lesson, because they could see actually how they could use the natural resources in the outdoor environment to benefit the children. I think that's because they are so used to using manipulatives and apparatus and a concrete, visual, abstract approach to teaching maths. They could really see how that concrete could be used in the outdoor environment. We still have base 10 or deans, but most of our classes use sticks and acorns, to be fair, now, rather than using deans. But yeah, most math lessons happen outside now.
Thank you.
Wow. I'm just trying to picture it. Sounds amazing, actually. Thank you. Sarah, you've got a question.
Hi, thank you. I hope this doesn't come across as critical, because it's not my intention. It's just something that I'm conscious of in my own research. So I'm interested to know how you kind of thought about these aspects, and it's to do with researcher bias. So I have two questions, but they're related. One was around how much the pupils were aware of what you were researching, your own perceptions on outdoor learning, and how do you feel these might have influenced the responses that the pupils were sharing? And the other question is, how much do your own perceptions of outdoor learning impact potentially on your interpretation of what the pupils were saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is both a limitation and an advantage of my research, and this is one of the reasons why I chose hermeneutic phenomenology as well as my methodology, because I'm so within the world of everydayness of outdoor learning and mathematics. I present at national conferences about outdoor learning. I'm a big advocate for it. So all of the interpretations are my own. And when we come to research, hermeneutic phenomenology accepts that we come with these preconceptions, these forehavings, these understandings we always bring with us through our natural attitudes of the world. And if someone else were to have done my research, the results would have been completely different. And I think this is why I'm not trying to say these are what I found, or these are my generalizable outcomes. What I'm saying is, through this process, this is what I have glimpsed at in the full acceptance that this is through my own lens and through my eyes. I have done quite a few reflexive processes. So I've published a couple of papers with SAGE and Qualitative Research Journal that look at the presuppositional interview and how I've conducted interviewing with my supervisory team in thinking about my presuppositions and how I bring those to there. I've also got one that's about penned illustrations. And so what I did is, because I know my participants, I wrote my own caricatures, if you like, of those children to try and really draw out what my preconceptions were about them. So did I think they liked math? Did I think they liked the outdoors? What did I think about them as a person? Because what I wanted to do is to really foreground my pre-understandings and biases in an attempt to be transparent. And I think that's what you, in phenomenological research, you want to try and do. You want to have that trustworthiness, and so you just need to be transparent about how you sit and what your positionality is. The children were fully informed. They knew exactly what the research was all about. I am their deputy head teacher. I am their teacher. They had a chance to say no. Would they have said no if they wanted to? There's a massive power dynamic there. I'm fully aware of that power dynamic. And I've done lots of things to reduce it. But then again, I can only do what the children tell me. And actually, if the research had happened on the following day, the children may have told me something completely different. And that's the understanding. These are possible examples of insights at a given moment in time, not generalizable outcomes.
Thanks, that's a great response and really useful. I wonder if you could put the links to the papers or the titles in the chat. That would be really useful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. Kia.
Thanks, Lewis. That was really interesting. I'm wondering, well, two kind of questions here. So stop me if we're kind of tight on time. The first being, do you find some students find the outdoor environment too overwhelming, and that you take them from a traditional classroom environment, or I think particularly students who aren't used to big open spaces, and they find that there's just too much that goes on there to kind of have that focus of any kind of mathematics?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we did. When we first started doing this, we did find that. However, we've been doing this for about 7 or 8 years now. So the children who are currently in year 6 have been doing their pretty much 50% of their spring summer lessons in the outdoors. So I think there is this goes back to why I chose to do it at my school, because lots of other schools had do bits and pieces of this, but actually for their learners, this would be very novel. And what I didn't want this to be is a novel experience that I was researching. I wanted it to be an ordinary, everyday, natural part of their learning that I was looking into. And that's why it's important to do it in our school, because I know we've done it for a sustained period of time. Some children do find things distracting. And so suddenly there's a deer that runs past or something in our forest, and that, you know, does take them away from the maths for a few minutes until you can get back on track. That does happen. But actually, what I tend to find is that those children who find it quite overwhelming, because of the spaces available, will go and they will find a place where they feel suits their learning best. And we have that principle that they have a choice over the locations they choose for their learning as well. And it goes back to that same thing with the classroom environment. Some people are very monochrome classrooms, so you don't overstimulate, and some people have got color, as many different colors as you can cram onto a working wall, the better. And it's that balance. I think you find that inside as well as outside as well.
On that environment, I was wondering, how curated is your forest environment? So is it very, obviously there's certain safety constraints that you need to bear in mind, but have you kind of considered that there are certain areas which lend themselves to things because of the shapes that you have kind of either grown there or that you've placed there, and it gives students that kind of little bit of sanctuary? Or is it just, here's a forest that's grown over the last 80 years, let's roll with that?
Yeah, we have different variations. So we have a small woodland, which we use for our foundation stage forest school, which is a little bit more sanitized, if you like. So some of the high level branches are cut down. Yeah. There's not so many things they can run into and poke eyes out of. Then we have our sort of a fire circle clearing. So that's an area that we have cleared in the woodland to be able to use an open area. We then have a very extensive woodland that is full of badger sets and fox dens and things like that. So you wouldn't necessarily be able to, you know, manicure it very well anyway. And we do use that for learning, but the children know not to go near the badger sets or stand on top of them in case they crumble down. And we're also very lucky that we have an area which is dedicated to high ropes course. So we have 4 or 5 different, we have Jacob's Ladder, we have Leap of Faith and things like that. So we have a high ropes course area as well for our high ropes that we deliver as part of our forest school. So different areas for different things, but we can take all of our school out there and a class would never see another class. We're very lucky. We don't have a school field, so we're never going to win the 5-a-side competition.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
No problem.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions or comments? Oh, while people are thinking, can I ask another thesis question, Lewis?
Yeah, of
the
course.
the audio is fabulous. The bird song, interesting actually, because listening to the bird song over the top, that is, I get that kind of feeling of calm and serenity from that. But I wonder how you're going to incorporate that so that your examiners get some of that delight, and also I suppose sharing it more widely. You know, beyond that, is the audio part of it or not?
Yeah, well, the audio is sort of the children you hear speaking in the audio are not the participants. They are afterwards, and they are narrating different extracts of the crafted stories that are part of my interpretation. And I use those in presentations to give me a little bit of a break, and also to immerse the audience in thinking about the words of, you know, coming from children. It sounds much more authentic, and also you get the sounds in the background. So they're not genuine bits of research data. I have discussed with my supervisors as to whether that would be an appropriate thing, how I could put some extracts of the transcripts into, whether they are voice acted by children or whether they are the original participants. But the one concern I have is that I've been very careful in all of my thesis to make sure the genders of the participants are not revealed. So all 5 are gender neutral names, and they also I use gender neutral pronouns as well. And that was a very specific decision, because what I didn't want to do was invite an interpretation of my analysis from the reader's perspective on the genders of the participants. And I also didn't want there to be, this is how it is for boys and this is how it is for girls, because I felt actually that would be something that would mask some deeper sense of the meaning behind the experiences. And actually, because I collected my data about 3 or 4 years ago, and I've been very familiar data crunching with the pseudonyms, I've actually pretty much forgotten which are boys and which are girls. And I think putting voice actors to it adds another layer of interpretation. So I'm thinking methodologically whether it would be appropriate or not.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd missed that in the presentation. I think it adds to the presentation anyway. Like you say, it raises lots of other issues. Yeah, thank you. Other questions or comments? No. So we've got because Cece's not here, we're actually finished in this strand. So we could, if there are things that people want to talk about, maybe picking up again, going back to Kadine's presentation or some other things that have come up today, if you want to talk about those now. And if not, we can take a break and come back into the main room for 2:45. Do speak if you want. Sarah.
Hi, it's actually a question for Nancy from her presentation earlier, if that's okay. I wonder whether Nancy would be happy answering it. It's to do with you were looking at the mathematical noticing and the sort of the impact of that, and the task that you'd chosen were chosen quite specifically to enable that mathematical noticing. Please correct me if I'm interpreting or remembering anything incorrectly. And so I suppose the kind of findings that you're sharing are around that mathematical noticing. But the other thing that came up quite a lot in that discussion was around the kind of getting to just the answer, and that idea of sort of speed and things like that. So I was wondering kind of how much the professional noticing is one side of things, and the task allows that, but the task also allows a slowing down of kind of thinking and a reduction of that emphasis on an ultimate kind of final correct answer. So my question is around what's the interplay between those two things, and in terms of the sort of findings that you have, how can you sort of determine, I suppose, whether the sort of mathematical noticing is kind of impacting on things, or whether it's the slowing down of the task and that type of thing. Hopefully my question makes sense, and I've sort of pieced it together well enough with what I'm remembering from your presentation.
Yeah, no, you have, and thank you, and yeah, happy to answer that. Yeah, and I think you've interpreted it right in the sense that we selected the tasks because we felt they had strong affordances for mathematical noticing, that there were things to notice, and yes, the task does slow down the maths because I mean, if you take the Magic V tasks, there are 3 correct solutions that you can find for that first arrangement of numbers 1 to 5, and then if you move on to numbers 2 to 6, there are 3 more solutions. But beyond that, and children did find those solutions relatively quickly. I think pedagogically, then what the teachers were interested in is getting them to explain why. So there was an equal focus on okay, now you found the solutions, and that was the important first stage. There was that focus on solution finding, but beyond that, why are all the solutions for the first set, the numbers 1 to 5, why do they all have an odd number at the bottom? Because that's really the important part of it. So it wasn't just that there was a slowing down, but the whole focus of the activity was less on the answer and more on the reasoning behind the answer. And the same with the other task that I showed very briefly at the end. I mean, there's a key piece of knowledge that all those totals, if you added up the numbers in the bags, were going to be a multiple of 3. Okay, fine, you can do that quite quickly, but that doesn't really get you anywhere unless you explain why that's the case. So the focus of the activity was very much on why, and it was in the why that the lower attainers made some important discoveries as well. And if you take the Magic V example, that the child that I showed having the fingers pointing at the 2 pairs of numbers that both made 5, her identification that those were the numbers that you needed to focus on was the first part in isolating the importance of that bottom number. So I think it's hard to separate out the different components of the task and the pedagogies, but for me the mathematical noticing was an important precursor to the reasoning. So it was inherent in the success of the task overall. So the lower attainers' success in those, both the early stages of their noticing of things like that bottom number, but also in their reasoning of why it is how it is. I think that their noticing was impactful in all of those places. So I don't know quite whether I'm answering the question of was it the slowing down or was it the noticing that's important, but I think because I'm not sure you can separate them out, because without the slowing down you don't have a focus on noticing. You've got to focus on speed or procedure or something, and so we were very much looking at something else. But I do think there's an application of a mathematical noticing focus beyond that kind of task. And if you're involved in primary and you're familiar with mastery and intelligent practice, then there are elements of intelligent practice that are trying to provoke an awareness of something by virtue of the order that questions are posed and the way that they're structured. So there's something in variation theory that's trying to say what's different out of all these things that look essentially the same, or what's the same out of all these things that look quite different, that has its roots, I think, in something quite similar.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I think on that the example that you gave around adding 10 to something and then rephrasing that to say, what do you notice when you add 10 to something? Like it shifts the focus from getting the answer to this calculation to here's a series of calculations. We're not interested in the answer, but we're interested in what the sort of pattern is. Thank you. That was a useful, helpful answer.
In the literature, and it's still sort of coming out quite recently, the effects of this pandemic. And while this is sort of a short-term solution, our remote learning solution is remote learning, something that's feasible in the long term. And so this research project will sort of look a little bit more into that. So the use of the internet and the use of online technology at the undergraduate level is not something that we haven't seen before. Over the last sort of decade, lecture recordings have been commonplace, especially in Western universities. Same with sort of lecture notes and the use of assignments, quizzes, course books being presented online. That's also quite common in courses. However, tutorials or laboratories or these interactive sessions where students come in and work with tutors and other students, this has rarely ever been done online prior to the pandemic, at least at the University of Auckland. And so the literature on tutorials is quite empty in that regards. So we were quite interested to see and to look into tutorials and the impact that they can have on student learning. So there were 3 research questions that guided this project. The first one, we wanted to see if there was a relationship between performance and the delivery method of tutorials. We wanted to see if there was a relationship between self-efficacy and the delivery methods of tutorials, and sort of sum that up and address and identify if there were any benefits of in-person tutorials for learning undergraduate mathematics. Firstly, so the lens that we sort of used to look at all of this was through the construct of self-efficacy, first proposed by Albert Bandura. It is defined to be one's beliefs about how well they think they can perform a given task, and it's a central mechanism behind human agency, which is used throughout his social cognitive theory. And we know that within mathematics, at all levels, we know that it's a significant predictor of achievement, not only achievement, but also many other learning outcomes. And self-efficacy beliefs are quite specific to domains. So across subjects, or even within mathematics itself, it can vary quite widely. Now, in terms of the study, we use data collected in the first semester of 2021 in a very large second-year service mathematics course. And so the reason why this particular semester was chosen was for a few reasons, in that this semester was the first semester out of lockdown for us, and sort of presented the first real return back to, I guess, normal classes. And so this was quite a significant milestone for us, and it was quite important that we be able to document and see whether the pandemic had any impact and on how students now perceived tutorials. We used a quasi-experimental study design, and so students were given the choice to gain their tutorial marks by attending in person or submitting their work online and working on these things individually, most likely at home. For the purpose of the study, only domestic students that completed all tutorials over the semester were included in the analyses, so that we can observe the impact that tutorials have when students were offered the choice. And so students were split into two groups: those that attended less than 50% of these tutorials, which we call the online students, and those that attended more than 50% of tutorials, which we call the in-person students. And so this was mostly done so that we could get a reasonable sample sizes within each group. But it should be noted that the majority of students chose to sort of go predominantly on one way or the other, which is not unusual when it comes to the use of live or remote learning methods. The data that we collected, performance data, came from final exam and overall course grades collected from our learning management system, and we believe that these two measures sort of represent the overall, an indicator of performance across the whole semester. Self-efficacy data was measured at two different points using the measure of assessment self-efficacy, the MACE, an instrument which is just recently it's been published and developed at the university and shown to be reliable and has been validated. Self-efficacy measures. So we have measured two different types of self-efficacy. Going back before what we said, self-efficacy being very domain specific, we want to measure students' tutorial self-efficacy and their exam self-efficacy. And for each one of these are each composed of two separate branches. The first being the emotional regulation component, and the second being the comprehension and execution. So the first one, the emotional regulation. Emotional regulation deals with students' ability to handle and to deal with their negative emotions that come with learning mathematics. The comprehension and execution factor deals with those beliefs that students have about accomplishing the task and completing the activities given. Firstly, we'll compare the performance measures between the two groups. And so what we observed was, in fact, that the online students, the students completing these tutorial questions at home or by themselves without the presence of a tutor or an instructor, saw a higher average final exam mark by over a grade boundary than those that attended these tutorials in person. Similarly, for the overall course marks, we saw that this pattern was also quite similar. And the reason why this is somewhat surprising and what really confounded us was that in the literature, the interaction with live components, namely live lectures, is often correlated with higher achievement. So in fact, what we observed was quite the opposite, seeing that online students that do not attend these tutorials are in fact related and associated with higher achievement in their final exams and overall course grades. And so perhaps could more capable students be more likely to work online? And we have to be really careful in terms of reading into the directionality of all of this. Or perhaps there is some third variable, some other mediating factor that we haven't even considered, and it's very likely that that is the case, with learning being so messy in that regard. So this is definitely something to look into for future research. Now, when we compare initial self-efficacy measures, what we see and what we find is quite interesting in that the online students reported having higher measures of self-efficacy than the in-person students. So again, what this means is that the students that chose to work individually online and chose not to attend these tutorials tended to have higher measures of self-efficacy, right? They believed that they could effectively complete these tasks by themselves than those that attended tutorials in person. When we now compare what happened after the semester, the final self-efficacy measures, it showed that the in-person group actually had higher measures of tutorial self-efficacy again, and this supports the idea that self-efficacy is a very domain-specific construct, with the online group still having higher median exam self-efficacy measures. However, we also do have to consider the fact that, again, they sort of start on different measures of self-efficacy initially. So I guess it is important for us to compare the change. And so when we look at the median difference in self-efficacy measures, this is sort of where the really interesting change is observed, and that the online students tended to have either no change or a negative change in each of their self-efficacy measures, while it was quite the opposite for the in-person students. They tended to have no change or to have slightly positive changes to their self-efficacy, suggesting an increase. And so one change that was statistically significant was that of the emotional regulation factor of tutorial self-efficacy, which again is quite interesting in that it is really highlighting a potential benefit that tutorials could be providing students. And so we believe that tutorials may positively impact students' affective field, a domain that sort of encompasses their emotions, their attitudes, and their beliefs. And also points to the fact that we really should be considering learning not just in terms of achievement, but in terms of students' emotional needs as well. These tutorials may help support and maintain students emotionally in their learning. And this could be one potential reason to way to explain this could be due to the sources of self-efficacy that these in-person tutorials provide. And just think back to your own classrooms, whether you're at university or at school, you can think of these opportunities to practice in class provide students with sort of the four main sources of self-efficacy. Mastery experience, students can practice solving problems and knowing that they can complete the tasks. Vicarious experiences, so learning from others, seeing others succeed, and letting that improve our own beliefs to also complete the tasks. Social persuasion, so just getting the support of others and the tutors in the room with you, as well as physiological states. We know that exams and tutorials are very, very different settings and sort of bring on different physiological states within the learners. The last point that we'll sort of just touch upon is that is within the context of all this, during the pandemic and with all of these things that we've just come out of, we want to consider whether students, how students are using tutorials. And so what's interesting is that within each of the groups, we can see quite a wide range of student ability that's being represented. And this may point to the fact that students are actually using these resources for a variety of reasons. And this may have been amplified by the pandemic. So for example, we could have students that are using these tutorials purely for social interaction. So we could have students that are achieving quite highly and still choosing to attend tutorials to sort of satisfy their need for social interaction. Students may really be using tutorials to ask questions and get help. We also have the opposite. We also have that students could be choosing to work from home intentionally, regardless of if they need the help, or for some students that live quite far away, it could just be a more convenient option, even if they believe that they could benefit from tutorials. And so we think it's very likely that, in fact, the pandemic has made these problems even more apparent, and it's something to, I think, to look into and consider. So there are a few limitations within this research. The first one was that this work focuses only on the impact of tutorials. There are lots of variables that couldn't be controlled for, including prior knowledge. So we think it'd be quite interesting to see whether this effect is observed within purely mathematics courses rather than a service course. This study was limited to very specific students in just one course. So there's a problem of generalizability, but we think that this is even just another reason for us to look into a similar effect and investigate this on a much larger scale. And as mentioned before, looking at more courses. Those are all the references. And yes, thank you very much for listening. Welcome any questions and feedback.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
It's very happy to know you are supervised by Tanya. I think she's working a lot with Loughborough as well. It's very good to know her. So now we have 10 minutes for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please raise up your digital hand and I can monitor the questions. Okay, Mariam.
I was saying thank you so much for this presentation. I was watching it with a lot of interest. One thing, it's not a question, but it's maybe a thought that I've been thinking of as I was listening to your ideas. I don't know if you've come across the research on learner styles and learner types. So there's a lot of research that suggests that people are not the same, you know. There are people that learn in a certain, so there are people that are, I haven't read much into it myself, but I think there are kinetic learners, there are, you know, reflective learners, there are self-learners, there are learners that, and I think this would be something interesting as your study progresses, because you might find that certain learner types, they function much better on their own simply because this is their way of learning, as opposed to grouping all learners in one basket and saying that for everybody, if you let them do the work at home, they're gonna achieve better results. So that's just something to think of.
Yeah, definitely. And that's something that actually we actually just talked about the other day in terms of getting more measurements and using maybe not just the mixed method approach, but using collecting many more measurements. And so actually there was an interesting paper I read which looked at flipped classrooms and looking at personality traits, and what are the biggest indicators of that, and which showed that I think extroversion was one of the sort of the traits that had the largest impact, which I thought was quite interesting. And definitely, so learner types, I'll definitely read into that and see if there's any more that I can find in there. So thank you for that.
Thank you. So any more questions from the room? So can I ask a question? Because you presented like a quantity research, and also I'm doing some quantity research as well. So based on the, like you mentioned, more people towards the online tutorial rather than in-person tutorial. But if you are going to analyze the data, and it looks like maybe the sample size for the online group is a little bit biased to the online group, because you have over 100 people for online, but only 35 or 32 people for in-person tutorial, right?
It was, I think it was the other, I think it was predominantly in-person tutorials, and then the very small proportion, online. And so that's something that you've got to take a little bit, look at quite carefully, and I guess acknowledge the fact that there is sort of this big discrepancy in terms of sample size and comparing those.
Yeah, but quite interesting. Yeah, I think the topic is quite interesting.
All right, hi everyone. Just I'll quickly, as the topic says there, for me, I just wanted to look at the challenge of teaching and learning angles, pedagogic intervention. This intervention is from my own context as a maths teacher. I'm involved with the mathematics mastery project with the NCETN. It's sort of like a math hub that does quite a bit of projects across schools, and the direction of it is moving towards a mastery approach. I believe there was a session in the morning by Jack. He touched on some of the key themes of the mastery program. So for us, for right now, I'm on the 3rd year of it, so which is the sustaining element of it. So we're now working in terms of more widely amongst other schools and just looking at all those key areas of mastery. But this research was something that I did last year with another colleague, and I just, as a practitioner research, I wanted to share and document it and just look at, you know, where we can go from there. So the first, as the slide there says, the case started with my observation, and that observation was from pupils who are, you know, having sufficient awareness of angles, you know, in their daily lives, but they're not able to understand the formal concept of it. They couldn't relate this, so there's still a barrier there. So what we did, so I'm now looking at what the difficulty might be. Why is angle such a difficult concept? And from my own experience, I believe there are 3 main reasons for this. So the first one was a lack of understanding of the dynamic character of angles. In other words, the movement that it happens when you're trying to measure angles, the different types of angles in that sense. The second one was a misconception in the measuring of angles. Again, it sort of relates to the measuring of angles. What I find is pupils come into school, they're all usually given a static view of angles. So measuring angles then becomes an issue. And then the third one was a lack of a schema, sort of like a structure for students to support their problem solving when it comes to angles. So these are the things that I felt from my own experience and from reading some of the available research on that. So much of this work was anchored on what Mitchell Moore had done, and where he found that pupils whose knowledge of angles limited, really struggle to develop a deeper conceptual understanding. So moving forward, I just wanted to explain what those 2 things mean. So the dynamic domain would be, an example would be like a door, the movement that a door makes to create angles. So, or a scissors or a swing, and that shows that dynamic movement. And the static would be what you have on the right there, where students are more familiar with. So identifying the problem then within my own context, we also find that it was a challenge for many of our students. Now, this was based on our own experience, but we wanted to find to quantify it in a way that we have, the solid data to move forward with. So what we looked at, we looked at the test scores from a cohort of students, and we analyzed that data to look at the number of students who attempted 2 key angles questions from the test and the number of marks that they scored for each question. For one of the questions, for example, just to move on, in terms of dynamic domain, there's evidence to suggest that when students employ dynamic actions for angles, they can create schemas, like I mentioned, that they can apply to other circumstances. So it's about that deeper understanding of angles, which can be applied, across the board in other areas. So what we looked at, one of the questions there, I don't know if you can see that, this is one of the questions that we analyzed. So of 142 students who wrote this test, we looked at the data, and there's only 26 of them were able to, provide an answer to, scored at least 1 mark in this question. So, and that is quite a low score overall. And this was supported what we already thought about our students struggling with this. Our own experience, historical experience came to bear, as well as, some of what I mentioned earlier about how students studied to understand angles in a dynamic form. So interventions, what we now did was to research what the studies on teaching angles and what was out there on the field, and also reviewed our schemes of learning to find where changes could be made to reflect a different way of teaching angles much more widely. So one of the books that I referred to was Craig Barton's How I Wish I Taught Maths, where he highlights the benefit of using goals-free questions. Now, goal-free questions are questions that you present to students where they're not expected to find any questions. So they construct their own questions. The goal is not to find an answer that you are presenting to them. So it serves as a schema to help them, approach the problem in a structured way, so that they avoid, juggling all the possible steps that lead to the answer. So it's a bit like stopping them from going towards that final answer. In other words, in a goal-free question, students can create their own question within that. They can form what their own question is. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. So this is a fairly straightforward example where several students can at least find some unknown angles here. They can use their knowledge of angle facts to at least get to certain points. Some of the more able students will be able to attempt more complicated things here. And then it goes towards a more difficult type of questions like this. But again, some of where when you look at this, there's a square there. Most students will be able to at least work out something. They can understand what a regular hexagon is, and so on. So even if not leading to any specific answer. So, and then it goes to where they can apply some algebra as well. And and it gets even more challenging with questions like this. The whole point is allowing students to structure their thinking in this way. So we went on to implement this. Here are some of the examples from our students, and different answers that they did. With these exact students, for example, this teacher guided their in terms of what they had to do. But subsequently, it's now become practice for us. Teachers can also design their own goals-free questions. And we also agreed that measuring angles will be taught explicitly in a dynamic way. Many times our students do not usually understand measuring angles in this way as a measure of a turn. So, and then understanding also discussion prompts. We agreed that discussion prompts were real life examples of angles that appear in their physical environment or and in everyday life would be taught explicitly, and they'll be used as a discussion to talk about it. For example, real life applications in angles where it's all around us. For example, where carpenters use them to measure precisely when they're constructing things. Engineers use them for buildings. And one interesting one is how angles are used to design parking spaces for cars. So it could be a good discussion point in talking about the advantage of using obtuse angled spaces to to accommodate more cars. So we also yes, this is an example of day-to-day real life example as well. With this, you could generate all types of questions. What kind of angles? Vertically opposite angles? Can we work out a straight line? Is it always an acute angle? So the type of deeper questioning that we are proposing can be used in real life example and the kids can also provide their own responses to this. So ultimately, the students eventually covered a whole unit of topics. These are some of the topics that were covered. And then we tried to look at we tried to collect a little bit of sample of what they're feeling, the experiences are. So what we did, the evidence of impact looked at a sample of work from a small group of focus group of kids. We also got responses from survey questions and a random selection of the work showing what they've done on those topics and examples of goal-free questions. What we found was that although this is ongoing work, the impact from what the students were saying was that it's interesting. You can see some of them, useful, challenging, good, all right. Sometimes some of their responses, they don't always convey it in the right precise way, but you can see clearly. We can see also from the books and from teachers' feedback, where we triangulate all of those evidence to show that there is a shift, and a positive shift, not just for the teachers, but for the students as well. So we made it a requirement that all our lessons must meet the following benchmarks. So we address the misconceptions in the definition of an angle. In other words, students must be able to express, understand angles in dynamic contexts, and also be able to translate that knowledge within the classroom. For example, there's no reason why students can't understand that the face of a clock can be a right angle, what kind of angles it forms, and so on. So to model the change in angle size using movements, I'm using online tools like GeoGebra and so on. Discuss examples of angles in real life, like I shown earlier on, and that could take the discussion and the learning, everywhere. Of course, guided by the teacher, and also including problem solving and reasoning questions using goals free. So these are some of the things that we have done. At this point, we're not able to have quantify the data like we did at the start to look at test scores. But we are hoping that at some point with a different cohort of students, we will set the similar type question. I will see how much progress has been done in that case. So like I said, this is a small project that we conducted, and it was quite exciting to do, to see how this is, helping not just our practice and the way we teach generally, but also to the students. And this is something that we're also sharing across with our other schools within our trust. So that's really it from me. I think I'm within time. So thank you guys for listening. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Henry. I think it's a very interesting presentation because you are really applying the maybe one of the cognitive science approaches in your math teaching, your math classrooms, the goal-free problem. So it's very happy to see you are really applying the cognitive science approaches. So now let's go to the Q&A session. So if you have any questions to Henry.
Yeah, thank you, Henry, so much. I found your presentation really interesting. And to be honest, when I was studying angles all along, it was always very static, as you're saying. So it was the first time for me to think of the door as an angle. So it was really eye-opening. Thank you for that. My question is more to you than to the topic. So you started right away talking about the literature on angles and how we teach them. But I wanted to ask you why? Why angles? What's the rationale behind it? Why is it that you thought this is an interesting topic to study? So maybe you want to tell us more about kind of the connection between you as a researcher and why you chose this topic in particular.
Yes, thanks, Mariam, for that question. In fact, I used to, just to your point, I used to teach I learned angle in that way. As in my early career, used to teach in a static way as well. So, as a teacher, we are learning as well. And this is also us shifting the way we teach. And, Craig Barton's book, which I read during this, was really quite useful there. But in terms of the topic itself, we looked at generally across our curriculum, the spectrum, to see where our students struggle. We had an initial meeting, and staff, we discussed this, and we sort of it became emerged that this was an area that we felt that our students struggled. So, but we didn't, like I said earlier, we didn't want to just go to and said this is based on what we think. So we decided to try and get some hard data for it. And also, we normally just have meetings where we do, we look at questions, exam questions, and sometimes these multi-step questions, that question, for example, has about 3 or 4 marks. These are where our students usually drop the marks. And these are the questions we feel that they can easily, they can at least tackle. They will gain more of the marks there. To do it, especially where we know that they have the angle skills to at least, do some, get on to do some questions. Even if they don't gain all 4 marks, they'll gain at least some. So we felt that it was a weak area. They can gain some marks based on the knowledge that they do have already. And, the teaching of it will be more interesting. Yeah, that's our rationale.
Yeah, that's really interesting. If I can do a follow-up,
Yeah.
do I have time? Because I think
Go-
it's a really
go ahead.
interesting topic. We can take this offline if we don't have the time now. But
Yeah,
I've come across a study where people would send the students with, very cheap cameras. Most of them have them already on their phones.
Yeah.
And you ask them to take photos of, let's say if your topic is angles. So you ask them to take photos of angles in life, and
Yeah.
so, she's driving her car, she's doing this, she's doing that, she's going shopping, and she just sees angles here and there, and you can have a kind of a display of angles in my life, something like that. So it would be interesting to maybe take this discussion offline and see if this could be something interesting to also do across cohorts.
Yeah.
So across different cultures, and see how people relate to because I think this problem that you've pinpointed is very real for a lot of other
Yeah.
contexts as well.
I think
So yeah.
it can be more, it could be taken within other contexts. I say it. And I think sometimes as teachers, just to respond to that, well, we don't stretch our students to the extent that they could, like do a little assignment and see how many of these examples you can get in your everyday life. Let's see who gets the most, unusual angles, or how many different angles, either the dynamic angles or angles occurring. I saw, for example, a building that has about 26 angles there, and at least several different types of angles. So it could be, taken in different contexts. Yeah, I'm happy to take the discussion beyond here, but thank you for your questions and your observations.
Okay, thank you. So Henry, there's another question in the chat. So someone asked you, did you try talking students outdoors to show where angles are present in nature?
No, I think this was because at the time that we did this, it was not a good time of the year in terms of the weather to take them out. But what I'm proposing now, I was thinking about that, is to ask the students to do a little assignment on how many different type of angles. I'm thinking about how I can structure that question so that they can get something rich about it. I could even do a display of some of the best types of angles occurring within their own physical environment, or and so on. So yeah, I think that would be a good idea. I really think so. And the kids will, they would love something like this, to see angles on, beyond the classroom.
Yeah, so hi everybody. Similar to the first presentation we heard, I'm also talking about mathematics in the higher ed sector. And I'm looking at cross-boundary experiences. So mathematics is no neutral enterprise. And I'm looking at kind of the cultural value of mathematics and what happens when we transfer mathematics across cultures. Does it stay the same or not? Now, why is this interesting? It's interesting for two reasons. First of all, during COVID, we noticed how, you can be based, let's say, in Africa, like I am now, and be watching a session on maths that is hosted by a university, let's say in the States. And so does mathematics and the learning of mathematics entail an embedded cultural element in it um, that we might not be consciously aware of? The second reason why this is interesting is because of the displaced learner situation that is currently growing due to the war situations and the refugee situations and so on. You have a lot of learners that are displaced from their original hometown. And so they naturally go to, learn maths in the school um, in their displaced context. And we might be disadvantaging these students because they are coming from a certain cultural background that they've associated the nature of mathematics with, and they're being embedded into a new one. And we might be underestimating the value, the kind of the mental um, baggage that comes with that. So that's the kind of things that I've been looking at. Today on the agenda, I'll start by setting the scene about the particular scope of the research that I'll be presenting today. I'll talk a little bit more about cultural transfer of a mathematics curriculum, different philosophies to look at that, the theoretical framework that I've chosen to adopt, the research design of this particular study, some findings and, some conclusions that I can draw from. So this is ongoing work. It's by no means, a finished study. It's just I'm sharing some of the thoughts that I've been having in the past couple of years. So setting the scene, where am I based now? My current role, I call it a bridge because officially it's called a liaison. So I work in a university but that is based in Egypt that has an academic collaboration with a university that is based in the UK. And my role is curricular transfer agency across these borders. So I'm going to be presenting, it's in the higher ed sector. I cover a lot of fields. For the scope of this presentation, I'm going to be looking at the mathematics curriculum for year one undergraduate engineering students. So what do I do? Practically, I get the deliverables from the UK-based organization, which includes teaching materials, assessment materials, learning objectives, teacher guides, and so forth. So some tools. And then I work closely with the module lead locally to make sure that the expected classroom experience is aligned with kind of whatever was envisioned in the curriculum. Now, it looks very neat and tidy on the slides. It's actually very messy in real life, simply because the bridge between envisioning something and enacting it is complex enough. And if you add the variable of culture, it becomes even more complex. And so, yeah, so we're looking at the cultural transfer of a mathematics curriculum across cultural boundaries. And there are different approaches that we can use to, or different lenses, maybe that's the word, that we can use to look at that. So one of them is the culturally responsive assessment measures. So each culture assesses things differently, and there's a cultural element to that. Culturally responsiveness in relation to a global classroom reality that is growing currently, and there's a lot of literature on that. Cultural responsiveness in relation to language and mathematics, and there's a lot of literature on that as well. You can look at it from an anthropological point of view in terms of teaching and learning. You can look at it in terms of power play, dominant versus less dominant pedagogies in different cultures. You can look at it from a philosophical standpoint, which philosophy of mathematics is more culturally accepted in which context. You can look at it in terms of teaching and learning activities. Some of them are more culturally accepted than others, depending on the context where you're teaching. You can look at it from an ethical point of view in terms of student diversity and how they accept a certain way of teaching. So these are all different lenses that you can wear to look at this one question. And I'm just pointing these out because there is a lot more out there And I'm just pointing this out to kind of accredit that these lenses exist. Now, in a previous study at BSRLM, I decided to look at this question from a culturally responsive philosophy point of view. I'll just go very quickly through the findings because they kind of act as a foundation for the work afterwards. So the findings were that if we have kind of on the philosophy spectrum, a fallibilist philosophy on one end and an absolutist philosophy on one end, then the case of UK and Egypt was actually almost at the two ends of the spectrum, particularly the academic institution I'm working with. It viewed mathematics as equipping students to model and create their own knowledge. There was a big concern about the amount of assessment planned by the local team, whereas the local team was more traditionally viewing mathematics as a subject that you have to master so that you can learn other courses and that you can only master by practice, practice, practice. So in terms of comparing philosophies, obviously the other studies, I can share with you the proceeding of it, but it was quite complex in toggling perspectives from a cultural point of view that related to the philosophy of mathematics. So building up on that, this time I'm looking at the power play behind it. Are there dominant versus less dominant mathematical pedagogies that play out in different cultures, and is there a power play associated to it? So when thinking of power play, automatically the first thing that came to my mind was the human condition theory by Hannah Arendt. It's a very popular framework generally in different fields, including political science. This schematic comes from a study that my supervisor and I had published last year. And basically, according to Hannah Arendt, she says that a person, so if you're introducing change of philosophy, change of viewing mathematics to a group of people, there are different states that change agents can find themselves in. The first one, she calls the laborer, the second one, the worker, and the third one is the actor. So if you're, as a change agent, put in a laborer position, as you can see in the blue side of the diagram, you don't have the power to change the microculture where you're at. You're just spinning in the same circle. The maximum you can change is the very small scope of what you do. Whereas if you're acting as a worker, you can empower change inside your very small scope. In this case, it would be, let's say, the course you're teaching, and you can somehow penetrate from your course to affect the wider microculture. If you're acting as an actor, you have the ability in this microculture, it would endorse you to collaboratively work with other people and hence channel the change much wider. So these are questions of power. Does the institution give you the power to act as a laborer, as a worker, or as an actor? And obviously, this is not something that is said explicitly. This is very implicit within the institution where you're working. And so what I did is I was doing extended interviews with module leads of mathematics in the undergraduate program. I chose a small sample of 2 mathematics faculty members with 10 years plus of experience in more procedural approaches to learning. And I was looking at their willingness to accept and reject the philosophy of conceptual teaching and learning of maths. And I was looking at that from the lens of power structures, as I've presented just now. So what were the main findings? I discovered that there is a very strong interconnectedness between instructor identity and the perceived identity of mathematics. So shifting to a different perception of mathematics as a subject matter or shifting to a different way of teaching mathematics meant that it intimidated their sense of being, their sense of self. This is who I am, this is how I do it, this is how I view it. Why are you trying to change it? And this sense of intimidation intensifies the rejection even more. As a result, the change agency is strongly rejected unless it gets endorsed by a leadership team, which means that any change agent that is going to be put in this situation will end up being perceived or positioned in the position of a laborer. I don't know if others have worked in similar circumstances or, you know, have thoughts, experiences, and suggestions of different ways of viewing this or how to deal with this.
Thank you, Mara. Thanks for contributing another very interesting presentation here. So now, if you have any questions, please hands up.
Hi, my name is Thelma, and I'm calling from Brazil. And I wonder if you checked, you know, when you talk about making bridges between countries, you have to deal with our condition of underdeveloped countries and the problems that you have. Did you try to investigate that? Was this an issue that was considered? I was wondering. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Selma. That's actually a really nice question. So, yeah, the way I choose to see it is I think that there is an unspoken power dynamic that classifies us as underdeveloped. And I think that's a discussion for another day, I guess, but there
Yes.
are some post-colonial roots to it. There are some hidden intentions that are rooted all the way back to colonialism that want to kind of put you in this box that you're underdeveloped and we're the developed ones. We know how it's done. And so what I've done is it's more of an asset-based model. So what do we have that, you know, the developed people don't have? One of the things that we have is we have a sense of community.
Yeah.
You don't find this in individualistic cultures. And so how can we build on this sense of community and, in a sense, export it to the world and, in a sense, be leaders in that sense? So as I worked on the other study that, you know, I pointed out a little bit in the beginning with the philosophies, that was the kind of thing I was looking at. What are the assets that we have in-house? How do we see things in-house? And how can we use these things in-house to be leaders of change in our own way? But definitely, yes, different ways of perceiving definitely plays a very big role in this challenge that I'm now having.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the next one is from Henry.
Thank you, Mariam. I was interested in your human condition theory. This really caught my attention. The labor within that dynamic, what is their recourse, if you like? Is there movement within that hierarchy? You know, because you mentioned they can't effect change. Am I correct?
Yeah, so it's not my theory. I have to give credit to Hannah Arendt. She's the one who came up with the theory. My supervisor and I worked on the schematic around it. So, but the actual work belongs to her. So, so basically what Hannah Arendt is saying is that let's assume you're in a situation where change is happening. And let's assume you are this change agent. Okay, you want to introduce something new. In your case, you're introducing the idea of dynamic angles, or you're introducing something that is new. Okay, so if you are lucky enough to be in a microculture where there are 3 or 4 other people that you can collaborate with, the whole culture becomes endorsing to your new idea. And hence you can penetrate the existing systems. Okay, because you're collaborating together and then you penetrate the existing more static systems.
So they'll
Now
be more
let's assume
receptive to whatever the change is.
Yeah. So when you penetrate the existing system can change. And in this way you achieve change. Now let's assume that you don't have these colleagues, but that you still decide that, you know, maybe my colleagues are all doing it the old way. I'm going to start doing it this way. In this case, you're working as a worker. So within your small box of operation, you're doing it differently. And it might seem on the outside that your course is different, But what you are not noticing is that without noticing, you're actually penetrating the outside sphere as well. Because before you know it, people will notice that something is different about you, that your kids are enjoying the class more, that they're achieving better, that this or that. And in a sense, you're operating as a worker because you penetrate the microculture by being a change agent within your small frame.
Okay.
Now, let's assume that you don't even have that sense of agency, that you are not the instructor. You're, let's say, the support instructor or the teaching assistant or something like that. And you really think that, the way we're teaching angles is, is too static and all of that, but you don't have this agency. So the change is within you, but whoever is leading the course is doing it in this way. And so you end up going in this vicious circle of having to act as a laborer, and change never penetrates through, simply because you're not given this agency. And so this research about change and the power related to it can be implemented. Is not only in education. You can implement it, I know people that have looked at history from that lens. It's about power in general. I've just thought that in my case, you can very well apply it to education.
Thank you. Thanks for the explanation.
Thank you.